Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. Before I introduce today's guest, let me tell you about Wondrium, our advertiser, Wondrium, Wondrium.com, is the former Great Courses, the teaching company. You know, I've produced a couple of courses for them. I've consumed dozens and dozens of their courses. It's fabulous. And it used to be you had to rent the courses and they mail them to you in cassette tapes. That's how long ago I started with this company. Then they shifted, of course, to DVDs. Then they shifted to online streaming. And now it's a subscription service. So you pay a monthly fee. You get access to all of the content and not just lectures and courses, but also documentary series, TV shows, and various learning projects. For example, here's one I'm going to take next. This is from the History Channel. I already took their course on secret societies, but this is a History Channel series, television series on the real history of secret societies. And so there are 26 of these units. For example, small town secrets, secret societies, the underworld of history, the Knights Templar, Masonic revolutions in America and France, the Bolsheviks, Masons, and the Russian Revolution. Adolf Hitler and the Thule Society. Yeah, that's a weird one. I wrote about that in The Moral Arc. Synchrony, Schemers, and Vichy France. Ancient mystery cults. This just goes on and on for 26 different lectures, all the way down to UFOs and the elusive George Hunt Williamson. Oh, yes. He made contact with the aliens. Anyway, it's a great source of information while you're driving, walking, hiking, biking, vacuuming the house, weeding the gardens, whatever. It's consuming content online now is the thing. Everybody's doing it. And of all the different sources, Wondrium is the best one. So give it a try. You get a free month subscription through the podcast if you go to wondrium.com/Shermer. So that's WONDRIUM.com, wondrium.com/Shermer, SHERMER. 1 month free trial if you like it. And why wouldn't you? It's great. You keep subscribing. If not, you cancel, and it's nothing lost. So give it a try, and thanks for listening. My guest today is the great Paul Bloom in his new book, The Sweet Spot. This is on the pleasures of suffering and the search for meaning. Paul is the professor of psychology at the University of Toronto and the Brooks and Suzanne Reagan Professor Emeritus of Psychology at Yale University. His research explores the psychology of morality, identity, and pleasure. He's written for numerous scientific journals such as Nature and Science, as well as for the New York Times, the New Yorker, and the Atlantic Monthly. He's the author or editor of 8 books, including Just Babies, How Pleasure Works, Descartes' Baby, and most recently, Against Empathy. This new book deals with a paradox, that is to say, if humans are designed by evolution to seek pleasure and avoid pain, then why do we not always do that? In fact, why do we often seek suffering and pain as a form of pleasure? How can that be? How do you define pleasure and pain? And how do you quantify that in a psychological theory? What is the value of suffering? Talk about Jordan Peterson's message. Here's quoting Jordan: "The purpose of life is finding the largest burden you can bear and bearing it," and why people seem to find that so deeply meaningful and having to do with human psychology, and the difference between controlled and uncontrolled suffering, and suffering as you experience it versus suffering as you look back on it after the fact. Talk about motivational pluralism, that is, any attempt to find a single explanation for anything humans do, but in this case, our motivations to seek pleasure and pain are going to have pluralistic, that is, multiple motives for it. Talk about the negativity bias and how bad things loom larger and more important to us than good things, and why that would be. Talk about BDSM and sadomasochism and the links between pleasure and pain there. We talk about films and novels and the 6 different plots of stories and why they all kind of focus on this, bad things happen to good people and then how they respond. And then we wrap up kind of talking about the nature of morality, good and evil, to what extent all of us have in us a darker side, and then wrap up discussing religion and the purpose of religion, which is largely to deal with this very subject of suffering and why bad things happen to good people, problem of evil, and then living in the now, what that means to live in the here and now versus in the past or the future. So this was really a great conversation. This was my longest podcast ever recorded, almost 2.5 hours. Paul is one of the most interesting people writing and thinking today, so I was really glad to have him on the podcast. So thanks for listening, and if you support the podcast, please go to skeptic.com/donate and make a small or large, whatever you can afford, donation there to support the Skeptic Society, which is a 501c3 nonprofit. So your donation is tax deductible, and that's what primarily supports the podcast. So thanks for listening, and enjoy this conversation with Paul Bloom. All right, Paul Bloom, nice to have you on the show. It's so good to see you again.
Thanks.
I don't think I've seen you in about 5 years. It must have been at least 5 to 10 years ago that I saw you, and I think it was in New Haven that we visited.
You were
Anyway,
visiting Yale, and we went out for lunch.
Oh, yeah, that's right. So, well, let's get started with, well, I'll have already read your proper biography, but you have, quite a collection of different subjects you like to study. I mean, morality in babies, pleasure, and what's the empathy and sympathy and the origins of morality, and now suffering or the pleasures of suffering. So give us a little, maybe a through line from your work, and maybe a little biography of, where you were born and raised and how you got interested in psychology, and then how you kind of branched into these different deep philosophical subjects.
Sure. I was born in Montreal, Canada, where I now am. Became interested in psychology largely because my brother Howard is severely autistic. So when I was a kid, I would work with children with autism and adolescents with autism. And I thought I'd become maybe a clinician working with this population. And then I was an undergraduate at McGill in psychology, and I came to realize that my gifts, I would not be a good person working with these kids. I lacked the patience. I lacked the skills. I really admire people who could work with those with disabilities and problems, and I'm not actually one of them, I think. And at the same time, I kind of fell under the orbit of a professor there, John McNamara, who was this brilliant scholar working on the interface between philosophy and psychology. And as an undergraduate, I ended up doing several projects with him. I went off to MIT to work with Susan Carey, and I did my dissertation with Susan Carey on word learning and language learning. While I was there, I also met Steve Pinker, who I think is a mutual friend of ours, and did some work with him. Wrote a paper on the evolution of language, and then I was kind of a language guy at University of Arizona for many years. Studied language development, wrote papers on language.
Oh, wow.
And then my interest started to, pardon me?
I don't think I knew that.
Yeah, I was, tons of papers on syntax and word learning and Chomskyan theory. I was actually, when I was at Arizona, I was a member of the linguistics department as well. And then my interest, as I've studied word learning, I realized how much of word learning involves the social capacities of babies and children, their ability to read the minds of others. And so I started to study that, and then my interest sort of diverged, and I began to be interested in just a set of topics clustering around what all my work has in common, such that it has something in common, is an interest in puzzling facts about people that are important, that are uniquely human, and that are just intuitively very interesting. So I've been looking at the origins of morality in babies and young children. That's research I continue. I've done research on art and why we like some artworks more than others, and why we hate forgeries. I've been interested in questions involving dehumanization and moral obligation. And over many years, I've been interested in mysterious pleasures. So it's not a huge puzzle why we like good food and sex and good company and being around those we love and being respected. The details are fascinating to work out, but it's not such a mystery why creatures evolved through natural selection would have these appetites. But why do some people enjoy being spanked? Or why do some people enjoy hot baths or scary movies or, in your case, extreme endurance activities? That's kind of a mystery. You wouldn't have predicted that based on first principles. So I began to, my most recent book, The Sweet Spot, is an exploration of that. And I started off the book just asking the question, why do we get pleasure from painful activity? So it's got to be called The Pleasures of Suffering. And as I developed this, the scope expanded and I got interested in the role of suffering in things other than pleasure and basically having a full and meaningful and purposeful life. And that brings me to sort of where I am today.
Yeah, that's definitely the big picture. So let's just start right there. What do you mean by pleasure and pain and suffering, and how do you operationally define these things as a psychologist, such that you could then study them in some quantifiable way?
Yeah. Um, it's a good question because these concepts could get slippery. And
Hmm.
I sort of, nothing in what I argue depends on the precise definitions. The phenomena are pretty clear. People sometimes like um, really hot baths that make them like flinch in pain, or spicy foods, or they go to movies that make them weep. So whatever you call that, that's the puzzle. But you're right. Let's so you, it'd be good to zoom in. Um, so roughly, pleasure is things that um, we just enjoy. We seek out and go and it makes us smile. It makes it's. I use pleasure as to refer to short term experiences, like sipping a nice glass of wine or getting a hug from your child. I distinguish it from happiness, which could be a little bit more long term. So even if you're having a terrible time now, you had a bad night's sleep, whatever, I don't know. Maybe you think there's better things to do. I could ask you, how happy are you? And you can say, I'm pretty happy. I'm living a good life. And pain and suffering are things that we typically try to avoid. That in some way injure the body, that tarnish the soul, and anxiety and stress and physical pain and unpleasant emotions. And so the puzzle is I seemingly have defined pleasure and pain in two ways, which are opposites. And yet we often seek out activities that are typically painful and get pleasure from them. You can define happiness in a way that seems intimately tied to pleasure, but often we get really happy. Our best lives are ones that are filled with difficulty and struggle. So those are sort of tensions I try to explore in my book.
Yeah, you're really tapping into the problem of other minds. How do we know what other people are thinking? So you go to the doctor because you're in pain, and they ask you on a scale of 1 to 10, what's your pain? And you go, well, I don't know, an 8. And then, they give you some painkillers, and then you go, okay, it's a 5 now. But of course, the doctor has no idea what your pain really is. But I guess in some way you could quantify it such that on average we could say, well, he's up here and now he's down here. Whatever it
Yeah.
really is in his brain, I don't know. But he's telling me that it's lowered. So what we're doing is working. And that's probably about as good as it can get. Same thing with the happiness researchers. They back in the day when they used little buzzers that you clip on your belt, and every half an hour, 2 hours, whatever, they would randomly buzz you and go, "How happy are you right now?" 7 or whatever. But I guess if you have a big enough database of this, you kind of get an idea that it goes up and down, and on average. And then here's how I solve the other minds problem is that I apply the Copernican principle to myself. I'm not special. So I'm probably pretty average. So if I'm feeling good and I and express my pleasure at feeling good in a certain way, and I see the same characteristics in your face and your behavior, then it's a pretty good assumption that you're probably feeling the way I'm feeling, roughly speaking.
I think that's right. I think that's right. I think pain and pleasure, as you put it out, nicely illustrate the puzzle we face trying to figure out what goes on in the minds of others. Is your 5 the same as my 5? If you say your life is
Yeah.
9 out of 10 in happiness, does that mean the same as when I say that? And, I don't think we could confidently say yes. At the same time, you're making two good points. One is we could talk about differences. If your life used to be a 7 and now it's a 9, I could say, well, it's gotten better, apparently. If one random population is an 8, another random population is a 6. You say, well, what's the difference between these two groups that you've chosen? Um, and the other point is that um, I think philosophically, I can put my hand over a flame and scream, and that really hurts. And I see you do it. And it feels like I say, well, maybe you're a zombie. Maybe there's nothing inside. Maybe you're just like a robot. And it's notoriously hard to sort of prove such skepticism wrong. But at the same time, parsimony and common sense and the Copernican principle says you're probably feeling pain just like I feel pain. You have the same kind of body. You've evolved the same way. You're making the same facial expressions and so on. And this is all necessary to do
So
a science of pain and pleasure.
yeah, yeah. So, and you're also tapping into the deeper issues of the evolution of emotions. So, talk to us about what are emotions? Why did we evolve emotions? What's the purpose of emotions? Because everything you're talking about is a kind of emotional expression, and then we can get into the details from there.
Well, there's been a huge amount of debate in psychology about the emotions, and there are different extremes. So one view is there's a set of basic emotions like locked in by evolution: um, fear, surprise, anger, joy, a list like that, and they have defined functions, defined areas of the brain, defined behaviors associated with them, clear evolutionary pathways. On the other extreme, the idea is that emotions are this hodgepodge, this cultural creation that blur together and can't be cleanly um, categorized and don't have localizations in the brain. Um, I lean more towards the first view, though I do think emotions do show a lot of cultural variation, both in how you experience them and how you express them. But but I think that in the end, emotions can be best seen as motivational forces that are specialized for certain sorts of situations, certain sorts of motivations. So fear is a response to danger, and it motivates you to run away, and get excited, get aroused, so you can defend yourself and run away. Um, you know, uh, uh, lust, call that emotion, is a response to a sexual situation that causes sexual arousal, suitable for sex, um, and so on down the line. And anger is a response to injustice, and it prepares the body and prepares the mind for aggression, for trying to fix this. And so I think for each emotion, you could kind of clearly, and this will admit a fuzziness, but you could sort of make a claim like, what's it for? And this is important because one thing I think everybody agrees on emotions is they aren't just noise in the machine. They aren't just like, oh, I wish I could be like Mr. Spock and not have any of them. Emotions are absolutely essential to living a full life. Because if you didn't have emotions, you wouldn't be motivated to respond appropriately to situations involving danger and threat and love and unfairness and so on. Emotions give you that motivation.
Yeah, like Antonio Damasio's research on people with brain damage that don't feel emotions, and they have a hard time doing anything, making any decisions. They just sit there frozen because they don't have a kind of a sense or feeling like, well, that's the right one. I'm going to do that. Or they'll stand there in front of a row of toothpaste in the supermarket and going, I don't know which one. Let me weigh them and measure them and decide and read the ingredients and on and on. Whereas you and I just go, well, I like the blue one because that's the
Yeah.
one I got last time.
Yeah.
That's kind of a feeling of it. So emotions probably evolved to drive behavior. So the example I like to use is, the evolutionary psych research on waist to hip ratio and symmetrical faces and clear complexions and what men and women like in the opposite sex if they're straight and so forth. But nobody walks into a nightclub, say if you're single, with calipers going, okay, your waist to hip ratio is 0.67, you're perfect, right? You just look around and go, wow, I find that attractive. And, that's what I'm interested in. It's just an emotion. But so it's in a way, it's a proxy that natural selection created. So we don't have to do these kinds of calculations. And you can apply that to calories and food or whatever. I just like that particular
That's right.
food.
That's right. There's a great quote by William James. He's talking about hunger. He says, sensibly enough, hunger has evolved to motivate us to eat food because you don't eat food, you die. But he says something like, I'm not going to get a quote exactly, not one person in a million, when he sits down to dig into his meal, he's starving, thinks in terms of survival of his body and reproductive success and fitness. He just thinks, I'm eating it because it tastes good. And and that's the way the emotions work. If somebody treats me really unfairly and I get really mad, I'm not thinking, oh, there's an evolutionary story for why I'm mad and so on. I just feel mad. This stuff is under the surface, which is why psychology is an interesting pursuit. It's not intuitively available to us.
So jealousy would be a driver to make guard. Disgust would be a motivation to not eat certain foods. One trial learning where you get nauseous on a single food item that you therefore don't want for the next whatever years. It's the body's way, kind of evolution's way of saying don't do that again. And in general, that's what pain does. It tells us, okay, stop doing that. Stop. Your hip is bad. Stop using it. Or in the case of, and would you go so far as to apply that to depression? There's research showing that, well, maybe depression is a way to get you to change your life, but I don't know, that seems almost counterintuitive. Why not some other emotion to get you to change your life?
There's a debate about that, and I don't have a side on it really. So one side says depression and mental illnesses more generally are just the system breaks down. I mean, the body breaks down. The body has diseases and injuries. Why not the mind as well? But another perspective says that some of the behaviors that you find in depression are actually adaptive in a way. And that for mild depression, not severe depression, but for mild depression, there's sort of a logic to it. So just like pain makes you flinch and scream, and I'm never going to touch that again, I'm never going to go there again, which is very useful. Um, Depression says, look, what you're doing is not working. And so lower your activity level, seek help from others maybe, and recognize that something is going wrong. And certainly this is true, I think, for things like happiness and pleasure. So pain evolved to ward us away from things. The positive emotions, the signs of a healthy, happy life, are basically your mind saying, things are going well. Keep it up. Good work. Do that again. Now, it gets complicated. So the masochistic pleasures we're going to get to make it complicated. It also gets complicated because we could short circuit these things. So, you take some cocaine or heroin, you're feeling magnificent. And you're not feeling magnificent because things are going well for you. You're feeling magnificent because people are extremely smart and invented ways to sort of short circuit the system, to mess around with Darwin and give us the pleasure without the accompanying thing that pleasure is supposed to be associated with.
So it could be that a mild form of depression has an adaptive purpose to it, but the strong version doesn't. It's just a extreme version of it that then gets carried away. So maybe if I'm feeling depressed day after day because I'm in a crappy job I hate, this is a way of signaling to me we'll change jobs. But if I'm clinically depressed where I can't even get out of bed,
Right.
I'm so
That's
sad
right.
that I can't even move. Well, how can that be adaptive?
That's right. And that's exactly sort of where I'm stand on the issue, which is I think attempts to describe severe mental disorders like major depression, where you don't get out of bed, schizophrenia, extreme anxiety disorders, where you don't leave the house. I think those are not adaptive at all. The people who have these disorders are in deep trouble. And it's just the mind isn't, we weren't created by, a omniscient God. We were shaped together by natural selection, and kind of sometimes our mind sucks and it breaks. But low level things, so even don't talk about depression, talk about sadness. Sadness is worthwhile. If you strip away sadness from somebody or strip away anxiety, they wouldn't last. Their lives would actually turn to dust because they wouldn't get any feedback that things aren't going well. Anxiety is a terrible thing to have and could be, disorders could get very severe. But if you never felt anxious, you'd never prepare. You'd never obsess. You'd never worry, and then you'd be unprepared. So there's an optimal level of sadness and an optimal level of anxiety.
What do you think about the debate on whether things like music and art and so on are adaptations, sorry, or they're like what Steve Pinker calls, cheesecake. It's, sort of a byproduct and a exaptation or a spandrel, as Gould called them. It's a byproduct of something else.
I think the answer is going to depend on what we're talking about. Um, and the story might for any of these individual things be complicated, and that it could be partially an adaptation and partially an accident. So for instance, some aspects of music like lullabies, for instance, may have actually emerged in some way as adaptations for connections between parents and children. Um, Jeffrey Mueller argues that sexual selection plays a role in our desire to create things. We create things to impress others, friends, potential mates, and everything. So, and certainly people who are wonderful artists and musicians do impress. Um, on the other hand, I do think that some things, say the visual arts, are probably fundamentally biological accidents. And whenever you say that, people say, "Oh, you're saying they're not important." But as you and
Right.
I know, all sorts of things that are deeply important, like antibiotics, or the idea of universal human rights, are plainly not the products of natural selection or accidents, and many kind of things which are kind of awful, like I don't know, hatred of other groups, probably did evolve. So so to say that they're not adaptations doesn't mean that they aren't of significance and value. As for stories, which I'm very interested in, narratives, the stories we like, the jury's kind of out. I think that there's sort of a mix, and I think to some extent the capacity for storytelling, both internally and also me telling you a story, has been shaped by natural selection in different ways.
Yeah. There's this evolutionary psych idea of that certain art forms are more appealing to us. They're symmetrical, or they have a certain ratio of shapes and so on, or like landscapes, in which I think this is Ed Wilson's biophilia. That the kind of landscapes that appeal to us are when we're high up looking down on a landscape in which there's like acacia trees and a body of water and some animals, and this is because we evolved on the plains of Africa or whatever. Anyway, so these arguments. But Ken Miller, in his book, the evolutionary theorist, he argues actually some of the greatest art of all time is not pleasant or pleasurable like that. And his example is Picasso's Guernica, which is this kind of
Yeah.
violent, angry, this depiction of war and conflict and pain and suffering. And this is one of the greatest paintings of all time. And many of them are like that. They're not pleasurable to look at. They evoke other kinds of emotions. And that gets into what you're talking about here in your book.
It does, and in different ways. In fact, the what got me started, what I've always been interested in, the fact we take pleasure from artwork that's difficult to look at. We take pleasure from stories that have sad parts, that scare us, that upset us, and that seems kind of paradoxical. Um, there's different explanations. One very simple explanation, which I've heard proposed for the appeal of negative art, is that the negative is more powerful than the positive. This is just this general fact about psychology, that things that are shocking and unpleasant, dangerous in some way, um, capture our attention. For clear reasons, they're more humanly relevant. If there's a really nice person in the room, that's really good for me to know. If there's an insane axe murderer in the room, that's even more important for me to know. And so something that depicts something terrible will just capture it. It's more memorable, more interesting. But I think that's just part of the story. I think particularly when it comes to the pleasure we take from stories, it gets much deeper than that.
So the negativity bias, in which painful things hurt twice as much as pleasurable things feel good, is an
Yes.
adaptation with obvious implications. But you're arguing gets our attention, and we're super focused on it. And maybe there's some pleasure in that process of being super attentive and focused rather than bored.
Yes. Yes. Um, that's right. So some art which might tweak all of our evolutionary buttons, say, oh, this is such a nice environment and everything. The problem with that is it could get actually kind of really boring. A nice
Yeah,
symmetrical figure or whatever, a nice landscape. Okay, I've seen it. That's good. Next.
right. All right, let me read to you a quote from David Hume that I think your research puts into proper perspective. You'll be familiar with this. Hume writes, "Reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions, and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them." I think a lot of people misread this, thinking, "Oh, Hume's telling us that we should just go by the gut of our instincts and our feelings and emotions," but that's not what he's arguing. How do you think about that quote?
Yeah, I think Hume is making a point that's fundamentally right, and it's something I know you've dealt with in your own work, and trying to it comes up a lot for morality, but comes up for just about all sorts of human action. And the idea is that rationality and reason is could be defined as sort of using knowledge and logic in service of goals. And you could be the smartest person in the world, and you'd be very, very good at satisfying your goals. But it doesn't in itself set goals. Um, there could be somebody who is a brilliant psychopath, smartest person you could imagine, but just likes making people suffer and uses their intelligence to make people suffer. And I take Hume's point as saying, you can't say to this person, look, you're wrong, you're not thinking right. But rather, the person seems to lack the right goals. And so in my previous book, which was called Against Empathy, because I argued against the idea of using our sort of gut feelings to make moral decisions, the subtitle is The Case for Rational Compassion. And the rationality part is just, if you want to make the world a better place, you got to think it through. You got to think of what will cause the best results, what's the most impartial, what's the fairest. But the compassion part captures Hume's point, which is you need some sort of feeling, some sort of emotions. Reason itself won't take you all the way there. Is this congenial to your view?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yes. I think, although, see, Steve Pinker and I just got into this last week when he was here for the show. We just released the podcast this week. We were talking about those feelings. Are they just culturally determined? Are they just random? And we just happen to think slavery is bad now, but who knows? Maybe in another century we'll all think it's a great idea again, and we'll bring it back. I don't think so. I think that Western civilization and in the world in general has been moving more and more toward certain emotions and feelings that do have a kind of a grounding in rationality. That is to say, the principle of interchangeable perspectives. How would I feel if I were a slave? As Lincoln said, I would not, as I would not be a slave, I would not be a slave holder. And that's your kind of principle of mind reading. Putting myself in somebody else's shoes. Whereas 5 centuries ago, no one would have said that. Slavery was perfectly understandable and rational and reasonable at that time. But that directionality to history, I think, is not random. It's not just we just happen to think this now, and centuries from now we may think it completely different. It's all culturally relative. No, I think there's a kind of a directionality to it for a reason, that we've gotten better at mind reading and then putting ourselves in other people's shoes. And Hume's other famous is-ought fallacy, I think. Steve and I were talking about this. I think it's what philosophers call a thin argument. He has that passage, almost a throwaway passage, like, well, you really can't derive an ought from an is, and he says it a much longer sentence describing it. But I don't think he's saying therefore it's all relative, and you can never derive an ought from an is. So I kind of flip it on, saying, well, if we know that certain characteristics of society lead to a decline of violence, say war and conflict, like democracy, international trade, and membership in international organizations reduces the likelihood of two nations fighting. Well, then we ought to do that. We ought to spread democracy. We ought to encourage trade between countries. We ought to all join different kinds of international organizations and work together to solve problems, because that leads to a decline of violence. But then somebody could say, yeah, but your premise that war is bad and people dying is bad is that's just subjective. To which I say, well, no, it's not completely subjective. I mean, there's a reason for it, as I would not want to feel that way. I don't want to be the victim of violence. I can suspect that you don't either, and therefore we should do this. But at some point, you run into the problem, because we're atheists, right? So we don't think, well, God tells us that it's wrong.
Right.
No. We have to derive it somehow. So how do we do that? And then at some point, you can't reach out of the system. We're in the system. So there has to be some rational argument to it. And I think a reasonable one can be made.
I agree with like 90% of that. I'm also a moral realist. I think there's been moral progress. I think the claim that slavery is wrong is not like a claim like, well, plaid is in these days, or something, or
Right.
it's not like fashion. It's not the thing which could ebb and flow. It's not a matter of opinion in the end. I think the wrongness of slavery is a discovery that people have made. I do think, though, and maybe you have a different view on this, that in the end, you have to sort of appeal to some to some premises that themselves can't be explained. Some universal goals we have as people. And so go back to your case. Suppose you told a psychopath who's doing terrible things to people, hey, how would you feel if people did that to you? Like, like the quote about slaves. How would you feel if you were the victim of that? And a psychopath said, gosh, that'd be terrible. I'd hate for that to happen to me. And then you say, well, so you're going to stop, right? And the psychopath said, no, I don't. I'm not them. I'm me. I fully
Right.
understand that from an impartial point of view, what I'm doing is sucks. I don't care. You say such and so stops violence between nations. I think every person who, just about everybody says, well, that's good. But you could imagine somebody who says, I love violence between nations. So much fun, so much
Yeah.
splendor. And I think at a certain point you just have to say, well, we can't talk anymore. And to defend your view that this is true also for logic, for science, in the end, science comes down to say principles of induction that themselves can't be justified. Mathematics comes down to fundamental axioms that can't be justified. So if morality is the same, it's not so surprising and doesn't take away from the sort of realistic picture that these things are real, picture that you and I would endorse.
Yeah. Political scientist John Mueller has a whole list of quotes he reads. Well, he prints in his book and he read on the podcast here of just a century ago, say pre-World War I, when everybody thought war was just a splendid, wonderful thing. It's heroic. It brings out the manliness in men, and it makes nations stronger, and just all these justifications. And what you and I just said would a century ago would have been like, what? Or maybe a little more than a century before the First World War, which woke everybody up to, this is really quite carnage. This is terrible. This is not heroic and
Right.
uplifting, right? And that's kind of the trend we've been on. So, yeah, it does feel like it's a cultural shift, and therefore maybe it's just culturally relative. But, Pinker makes the point that the argument that the idea that there's nothing special about the spot I'm standing on just because I happen to be standing on it is an idea that has been spreading more and more. This is Peter Singer's expanding circle. And that, more and more of us, save the lifeboat cases of the psychopaths that say, no, not me. But most of us now agree, well, this is wrong and this is probably right. And therefore, and all rights revolutions have been kind of moving in this direction. So now we're going through the trans movement. Hey, we want to be in that expanded circle too. Okay. And, most people look at that and go, yeah, that seems right, because I wouldn't want to be treated that way. And although there are exceptions, so in kind of a utilitarian way, more and more of us think that, this is a good thing for society.
I think that's true. I mean, you and I are both old enough to appreciate the profound differences there have been over the last many decades regarding treatment of ethnic minorities, treatment of gay people, treatment of trans people. Treatment of trans people has undergone a moral revolution in the last decade or so. I remember seeing Jon Stewart, a very liberal paradigm. I loved his show, and he would openly mock trans people. He had some really, that'd be very funny that people would do that, and things have changed radically and very quickly. And I think Singer is right in talking about a sort of expansion of the moral circle. Now, this isn't to say there aren't problems with this. So I often get into sort of discussions in seminars about moral circle, and I say, isn't it great to have moral circle expand? And students say, yeah, it is. And they say, so the next step is to expand it to fetus and embryos. And people say, well, no,
Right, of
that's
course.
too far.
Right.
You see, they shouldn't have the full moral rights. And I think that's actually correct. But what that shows is that the question of how far to expand it, should we expand to rocks, to trees? No, no.
Right.
And
Lobsters.
the question how is often a difficult question. And that's what we
Yeah.
struggle with as sort of moral thinkers and as a society.
Right. So there I invoke the idea of conflicting rights. So rights are not absolute in that sense that, they're always applicable in all situations. So here you have the rights of the fetus to live, and it's okay, I think, to acknowledge. I'm pro-choice, as I assume you are, but it's okay to acknowledge, the pro-lifers have a pretty good argument. That is a living organism in there. It is a human. It's not it's a potential person. It's not a legal person until it hits, I think, the end of the second trimester. at least in California, I keep trying to remind myself to look this up for other states, but like when Lacey Peterson was killed and she was, I think, 8 months pregnant, it was a double homicide. So the law treats that as a person in the third trimester. Well, you have to draw the line somewhere. And so why not acknowledge, okay, you pro-lifers have a good argument. It is a human being in there, and you are killing a human being. But it's not a person, and you have the rights of the woman to make the decisions about her own body and her own life. And, this idea that, people are killing babies for fun is ridiculous. It's the hardness of life, not the hardness of heart, to quote a famous paper on this subject, that, most of the abortions are conducted by poor people, poor women who can't afford to add another child to their life. And, there's reasons for this. So, or take the trans issue of, male to female trans entering women's sports or women's prisons or women's bathrooms. And here we've spent a century, women fighting for the rights to have their own competition, their own sports, their own Title IX, their own funding in schools for sports. And then now these guys want to come in. Well, yes, I support trans rights, but I also support women's rights. So who's right? Well, we have conflicts, and this is what the messiness of democracy is about, right? So, yeah, it gets messy at that on the edges there.
There are conflicts. There are conflicts of the sort you're talking about. There are also questions that need to be worked out about what sort of things do have rights. So there are sometimes people talk about rocks or trees or the environment in general as something that intrinsically has rights and moral status. And I think that's nonsense. I think rocks and trees and the environment are extremely important insofar as they're of value to sentient beings like people or animals or non-human animals. But if something doesn't have consciousness or experience, it's only valuable to the extent it's valuable to other things. And there are people who disagree. So I find the very fact that people can sometimes productively argue about moral issues and sometimes change their minds on them suggests that this isn't just fashion, but there's actually something sort of more substantive here.
This would be like the argument that future generations have a right to a living planet, a viable, sustainable planet, and so on. Yeah, but what about the people living now who are poor and, barely scraping by in these poor third world African countries? Don't they have a right to have fossil fuels so they can produce energy and get themselves out of poverty and so on? It's nice for a first world European or American to say, I want to protect the rights of future generations. Well, but what about these other people that, have a right to prosper now? And there's only one way to get it until we get sustainable energy and so forth. So there you have conflicting rights.
You absolutely do. You also have a very deep question about how much to discount the future. So suppose you don't care about the future at all. You say, well, let those poor people, just give them whatever they want. And if the world comes to an end 100 years from now, who cares? That's one extreme, which nobody has. But the other extreme, which some people do pose, and Tyler Cowen in his wonderful book, Stubborn Attachments, make the case that we shouldn't discount the future at all. So if you could act now that would save the lives of 1 billion people 1,000 years from now, it's worth doing, even if it causes, pain for people, 1 million people right now. And with climate change issues, we deal with exactly these questions. How much suffering now could we cause to defer suffering in the future? It's very sweet to think that our steps to avert climate change will all involve benefits to people in the here and now. That's typically not what it's going to do. Someone's going to suffer now to the end of future generations. I mean, we do this ourselves when instead of spending, some excess money I have on a really nice meal or a trip, I put it in savings. I'm saying, well, future Bloom is going to benefit from this, even if present Bloom is going to suffer a little bit.
Right. Yeah, I love this quote you have from Tyler. He's one of the most interesting thinkers today. What's good about an individual human life can't be boiled down to any single value. It's not all about beauty or all about justice or all about happiness. Pluralist theories are more plausible, postulating a variety of relevant values, including human well-being, justice, fairness, beauty, the artistic peaks of human achievement, the quality of mercy, and the many different and indeed sometimes contrasting kinds of happiness. Life is complicated. And you call this motivational pluralism. I think that's absolutely right. You have to take that approach to study this problem you're addressing in your new book?
If I have a punchline to the book, and I try to say many things, it's that what you just quoted. It's that there's a lot of people who think we just seek out pleasure. And I think that they're right, that we do seek out pleasure. The people who say we don't are just plainly mistaken. But we seek out other things too. We want to be moral. We want to be good, like do good things. We want to have lives of meaning. Some of us are interested in truth, some in beauty. And the story is complicated.
Right. Yeah. So let's get into that. The problem you're trying to solve is, since we have these more evolved emotions, why do some people gravitate towards something that the rest of us would move away from? So what do we know about why the pleasure of suffering?
So it can even be framed in a different way, which is that people are drawn in different ways to different sort of suffering. I've never met anybody who didn't have some sort of appetite involving suffering. I never met anyone who said, "Oh, I don't like movies that make me sad or scare me. I also don't like spicy foods. If I get a sprained ankle, I'm not going to press on it. I don't like hot baths. I don't like saunas. I don't like BDSM. I don't like projects that make me anxious." Pretty soon you give it them a list, and so I say, "Yeah, that's for me." And like I said, my book has sort of tells two stories. One is suffering as a route to pleasure, and the other one is suffering as a route to meaning, fixing with the motivational pluralism you talk about. And suffering can give us pleasure. Um, and one way this could happen is goes back to our discussion of the emotions. So being afraid is often a thing you want to avoid. But this is because fear is typically associated with things that could hurt you. You know, you say, "Do you really want to go to this dangerous part of town in the middle of the night?" I said, "No, I'm scared." And I think what I mean is like, I don't want to get killed. But suppose I could feel the fear in a safe way and kind of experience and take interest in it. Well, Halloween's coming up. I'd love to go to haunted houses. You know, I wouldn't go if I felt people were going to stab me or something, but being afraid in a safe environment can be a source of joy. So too for anger and sadness. And this is sort of one interesting aspect of how, for humans and no other creature, what's typically negative can become positive.
So let's talk about the difference between, say, suffering that you can control versus it just happens to you, and then the experience of it versus afterwards when you
Yeah.
look back on it. So, soldiers will often say, the most meaningful part of my entire life was that, 3 years in war with my buddies. But I doubt they would have said that at the time when they're in the trench and
Yes.
suffering and miserable
Yeah.
and they could die. It's kind of looking back on it. So let's cut it those two ways.
Yes. So to take in the first way, I just wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal. It was like a summary of my book. And the very first one, a very angry email. And you've written a lot. You know, you get angry emails. And this angry email was, "You freaking idiot. You're saying suffering is good. I've suffered from chronic pain my whole life. You don't know what you're talking about. You're just a monster." And I wrote her back. And we're not buddies now, but we're corresponding. I wrote her back and said, "I'm talking about chosen suffering. I'm talking about the suffering, the sort of examples we've been talking about. Unchosen suffering is very different. Unchosen suffering is much more of a mixed bag. I'm talking about choosing to go to war, choosing to have children, choosing uh, to experience BDSM, sadomasochistic sex. The experiences of having somebody you love die, becoming maimed, um, uh, being assaulted, are horrible. And I and we're very good storytellers. So some of us could tell stories that kind of find meaning from it. But in general, I am not saying that's good. I've been accused of making counterintuitive claims in my career. This is not one of them. Bad stuff is bad for you. Um, so it's chosen suffering. And now this brings us to the other distinction, which is some sorts of chosen suffering are kind of fun while you experience it. You're sort of experiencing the pain, but feeling it's associated with mastery and command and flow, maybe. And some sort of chosen suffering you choose as kind of an investment in the future, where what you experience pain now, so you could look back on it later on and find it gives your life meaning and shape and texture and importance. There's a lot of activities which a long grueling hike, where if I could snap my fingers and find myself in a nice hot bath back at home, I would. But then when it's over, I think I'm glad I did that. And so there's sort of a temporal aspect to this that's worth keeping in mind.
Yeah, you talk about in sadomasochism that people have a safe word, so that gives them control. I want to have this kind of edgy, risky, potentially slightly painful, but I can stop it at any time when I give my safe word. There was a big story here a few months ago of one of the major Dodger pitchers who apparently was in a relationship with a woman along these lines. And they have tons of texts between the two of them and emails where she's saying, I want to do this, I want to do that. So it looks like, she's into it. But the gray area is it looks like at some point she gave the safety word and he didn't follow. He just continued, with the aggression or whatever, the suffering or whatever you want to call it. And so now there's a potential lawsuit here. Or you mentioned Christopher Hitchens, when he did waterboarding. The difference there, of course, is that he had a safe word. He was actually not a safe word. He was holding a little steel bar in his hand, and the moment he dropped it, they would stop the waterboarding. And he wrote about it. It's very moving. And he said, "This is absolutely terrible. It's torture. If this isn't torture, nothing's torture." And so he made his point. But the people that are actually getting waterboarded, they don't have the little steel bar they can drop to end it.
Yeah, that matters a lot. So right, so Hitchens says it was torture, but if anything, it's so much work. The thing about having water poured into your mouth while you can't stop it is that these are not being done by people who like you and who care about you, and there's the terror, as well as in general the lack of autonomy, often the humiliation involved in it. C.S. Lewis, the religious writer, distinguishes fasting, where you choose not to eat, which could be an exercise of pride and autonomy, versus somebody withholding food from you, which is just awful. And even more mundane things. So sometimes, I really like a hot bath, just sinking into a hot bath, controlling, and waiting for it to cool down. But if two really burly guys push me into a hot bath, has nothing to recommend it. So control is absolutely pivotal for all of this, and for both the pleasure we experience and also morally. The story you tell me, I mean, as you tell it to me, and I don't know the case, as you tell it to me, sounds more like a lawsuit. It sounds like criminal assault. If you do something to me against my will and I tell you to stop, that's assault, and should be, because the law recognizes that it's terrible.
Right, consent as a moral, a line of drawing the moral,
Yes.
Drawing the moral line. Sorry, yeah,
yes,
is certainly
yes.
there,
and it's complicated, because if you and I put on a boxing gloves and we have a friendly bout of boxing and we both consent to it, and you're like punching me in the head, well, I didn't want that. I didn't consent to getting hit in the head right now, but I consented more generally to that kind of event. But if I say, okay, stop, I'm done, and you chase me around the ring trying to punch me, that's a whole different story.
right.
So
Yeah. And then the suffering after the fact. So like Viktor Frankl's, deeply moving narratives of what it was like to be in Auschwitz. This is some of the greatest literature ever, and in one of the most important books anyone's ever written. And I gained a lot from it, but I wouldn't want to go through that. I'm sure he wouldn't want to go through it either. So there's the things that just happen to you that you can then spin into or turn into something
that's
positive,
right.
rather than like a lot of people, they just had miserable lives after that because of the suffering.
I think that's right. I think that's right. And there are sort of two books that guided me as I wrote The Sweet Spot. One is Flow by Csikszentmihalyi, who sadly passed away just, I think, last week. And the other one is Man's Search for Meaning by Frankl. And Frankl says something. Frankl's main insight. He's in the concentration camps, but he's a psychiatrist and a thoughtful man. He asks himself the question: what distinguishes those who survive, and what distinguishes those who commit suicide and don't? And some of it's just random blind luck, but some of it is. He said it's whether they have meaning, whether they have purpose. Purpose will keep you alive in a way that other things won't.
Right. And those that had that survived and did better than those that didn't. So
Yeah.
you would recommend cultivating something like an attitude toward higher values and purposes in life, that when the bad things happen, you can then put them in that bin of, well, this is part of what's going to make my life richer when I look back on it. So while I'm unhappy and suffering now, it's going to have a deeper meaning later.
I would. I would also just recommend, or, the data suggests that one route to a full life is having purposeful long-term projects. It, for one thing, if you just seek out pleasure, there's several problems with it. One problem is what people call the hedonic treadmill, which is very quickly satiate. If I really enjoy a great meal, well, after I have a great meal over and over again, it just get used to it, get bored with it. And so a second problem, and there's some interesting research on this, is if you seek out happiness, it tends to be associated with being less happy. Now, so there's always studies we ask people, how much do you want to be happy? And then, are you depressed? Are you miserable? And people say, yeah, really want to be happy and I'm depressed. Now, causality is complicated there. It may be that seeking out happiness isn't necessarily bad for you. Rather, people in dire straits tend to seek out happiness more. But still, I think it's suggestive. And finally, there are other things we should want. And hedonists, if any exist, pure hedonists, are kind of jerks. You should be. I think there's just a moral argument for not living your life trying to get the right buzz, but living your life trying to make a positive difference in people's lives.
Yeah, your whole discussion in the book on the difference between happiness and purposefulness or meaningfulness, I thought was really important.
Yeah.
When I was caretaking for my parents, it wasn't fun. I wasn't happy doing it, driving my stepdad around to doctors all the time and hospitals and clinics. And, he could barely get around. And then he, had taken him to a nursing home and he hated that. And, but when I was doing it, I was thinking, well, this is the right thing to do. I mean, this is what we do. We take care of our family members, and I would want somebody to do that for me. Although I wasn't thinking of that's why I'm doing it. It was just like, well, this is what you do. And it wasn't fun. But when I look back on it now, I thought, well, I'm a better person for that. That makes me feel like I have a more meaningful, purposeful life. Although it wasn't pleasurable. It wasn't fun. It didn't make me happy at the moment. And I think that's an example of what you're talking about.
And I think a theory of psychology that doesn't take into account such motivations is really inadequate. And, I know people, I know some psychologists who would say, well, you must have got some sort of pleasure from it, some sort of kick to it. Maybe look at you think, oh, look what a good guy I am, or what kind of award I'll get in heaven or whatever. But this is psychologically not true. You did it. People do things because they think they're the right thing to do. And for most of us, not all of us, that in itself is a motivation, just on a par with the motivation to get pleasure from something.
Yeah, like having children. You have the whole discussion of Dan Gilbert talking about, well, the happiness research shows that people are less happy after they have kids. So why does anybody do this? Well, because happiness is not the measure. it's meaningfulness or purposefulness or having a deeper life.
I think having children, the literature in having children is fascinating, and originally the story is very clear. It gives you less pleasure. Some cross-cultural studies find that that's particularly true in the States. In countries which have more childcare and more support, sometimes parents are happier than non-parents. But regardless, it illustrates one of the points in my book, which is I don't think people have kids because they think that it's going to give them a constant buzz of pleasure. Or if they do have kids for that reason, they'll quickly, after waking up 4 a.m. to change a diaper or quell a screaming kid, they'll say, boy, this was mistaken. This is not a pleasure technology here. But it gives you other things, other things of value.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I have 2 kids, so I just endless stories of this, but it's pretty common. Again, it's just not just looking back like, oh, my life was richer because I had kids, but even, moment by moment, half the time I'm frustrated. I can't get my work done because my little 5-year-old comes in here and so on. Well, but that's also kind of part of the experience. It's just not just looking back. It's like, well, this makes my life richer. Otherwise, it'd be kind of boring if I was just sitting in this house by myself. No wife, no child, just me and the dog. It just wouldn't be as rich.
Yeah, yeah, and the way human nature works is, um, my kids are now adults and long gone, and I kind of miss them, and I even miss those struggles that I had. And then when I had them, I missed the fact I couldn't go whenever I wanted to and have fun. So
Hmm.
so we're always kind of pining for
Exactly.
what we don't have.
Well, that's your motivational pluralism there. It's just there's
There we
lots of
go.
different
Yeah,
motives there. All right, let's talk about stories. I loved your whole chapter on stories. There's so you cite David Robinson's analysis of 112,000 plots from Wikipedia. I love big data analysis like this, which could
yeah,
never have been done before. When we were graduate students, it would have been a couple of graduate students sitting there reading through novels, trying to figure out what they're about and how to
yes,
categorize them. All right, so he has 6 plots: rags to riches, that's the rise; riches to rags, the fall; man in a hole, fall, then rise; Icarus, rise, then fall; Cinderella, rise, then fall, then rise; and Oedipus, fall, then rise, then fall. It's amazing that all of Hollywood and all novels can be uh, distilled down to 6 different plots.
yes. I think a lot of Hollywood movies can uh, be distilled probably into fewer. Probably just man in a hole, man gets out of hole. Somebody faces obstacles, struggle, 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 boom, they get out. Um, and what I try to do in this chapter is try to ask the question, why do we like stories? And in particular, ask the question, why do we like stories that have aversive aspects? So, you know, um, if there's a story of happy people having delightful, adventurous lives and wonderful lives, maybe we like that story because you could feel, oh, that could be me. You vicariously, you have a lot of empathy in listening to or watching a stream. You say, oh, and I get a pleasure too. Maybe it's a theory of pornography. Maybe that's a theory of certain adventure movies. But why do we like stories where bad things happen or stories that end on an unhappy note? And there's a lot of answers to that. One answer, and I'll say this because in case somebody thinks I don't know about this, you can simply resonate to the artistry and intelligence of a story. Not everything has to be at a gut level. You say, hey, that's just a beautiful story, well told, and I'm very moved by it. But I think that there's other things. One thing is, and to give a sort of simple case, is is you might enjoy aversive parts of a story because there's a natural trade-off. So I talk about revenge films like John Wick. Have you seen the John Wick movies? Okay, well, I'll
But
tell you, there's no
I know
spoilers, right?
revenge films.
So
Yeah,
so
go ahead.
here's the idea. The beginning, he's a retired assassin. He bumps into some Russian mobsters. They kill his dog, and then in the rest of the movie, he kills everybody. Everybody kills it. And people find it very gratifying. And the part where his dog is killed is very sad and upsetting to see. So you say, well, why is that part of the movie? You think, would it be a better movie if we took out that part? Well, no, because that part is essential for getting the enjoyment of the rest. So sometimes aversive parts of movies are essential to experience the rest of the movie. There's sort of a natural rhythm to it. I also think, and this goes back to the question of what's adapted and what's not, that there's an evolutionary reason for why we pursue unhappy stories or unhappy situations. And this has to do with the idea of evolutionary theories of play. So the standard theory of play is like, why do animals play fight? It's a kind of crazy thing to do. But the answer, which I think is right, is it's a way to practice. It's good to be able to fight. And one way to be good at something is to do it a lot. But if you get into real fights, you get killed. You kill somebody. So evolution had this real clever trick, and dogs do it, for instance, where you get together with other animals you trust and work at it in a kind of a play acting way, not going full strength, but getting better at it. And I think we play in our imaginations. Um, One way I put it is if you want to get good at flying, particularly for difficult situations, you could fly a lot and practice crash landings and practice disasters. But there's a lot of dangers in this. Much better to get a flight simulator and do it that. And the idea is to brain as a flight simulator. And then the natural conclusion is well, what do you most want a flight simulator for? And the answer is bad situations. So the idea is, and it's not original to me, a lot of people propose, Stephen King actually talks about this for why people like horror movies, is it's a way to explore bad situations. And that's of plain adaptive value. I could fantasize about winning a big award, but the truth is, if I win a big award, I know what to do. Thank you very much. I'm very happy about a big award. What about my partner leaving me? What about the government collapsing and there's no police? What about, I'm falsely accused of a terrible crime and I'm a fugitive, whatever. Well, those are unpleasant, but those are the things that are worthwhile thinking about. And what we see in so much of fiction is imaginative recreations of worst case scenarios, and they suck us in. My favorite example is zombie movies. So plainly, we don't have to worry about being attacked by zombies. That's not really possible worry. But zombie movies, zombie TV shows are never about zombies. What they are is about what will you do when society collapses? And let's explore that. And we can't stop ourselves from looking because at some level we're very interested in
that. Right, right. I was thinking of the Clint Eastwood Dirty Harry movies and the Charles Bronson revenge movies. I forget what those were called, but in the case of
Death Wish,
the Dirty Harry, he was say it again, Paul.
A Death Wish. The Charles Bronson.
Death Wish. Yes. So if I recall, Clint Eastwood's character was a cop, but Charles Bronson was not a cop. He was just a citizen, right? He was like Bernie Getz, just getting revenge on the hoodlums and thugs of New York City. And those are incredibly satisfying. I mean, when Clint Eastwood sits there in the famous line with the, make my day, go ahead, make my day, which Reagan quoted as if, he was going to get revenge on the people that don't like America or whatever, tapping into that deep emotion. And I was also thinking about the girl with the dragon tattoo. She gets raped by her landlord, and then she gets him back where, she bites him over and he comes over and she tases him and then ties him up and tattoos him and zaps him and beats the crap. It's just so satisfying. Why is that so satisfying?
Because we're moral creatures, and when we think, we say, oh, people are moral, there's an evolved morality. People's minds go and think, well, that's why we help people. That's why we care when someone else is in pain. That's why we want resources to be distributed equitably. And that's all true. Those reflects our moral natures. But our moral natures also show up in one very particular, I think, uniquely human trait, which is we want to see bad people suffer. It is deeply satisfying to see bad people suffer. There are two books I own somewhere back there that each purport to capture an enormous range of literature. And one of them is called Comeuppance, and the other one's called Revenge Tragedy. And so this appetite shows up in the sort of schlocky films we're talking about, Clint Eastwood, Charles Bronson, shows up in Shakespearean, like Hamlet, which is we like seeing people get theirs. And that's just this fundamental appetite that we have. And of course, we see it in the real world. I mean, I'm on social media too much. And the favorite genre of social media is on Twitter. Like it's, oh, somebody did something bad. Let's all attack the person. Let's make them pay. Let's pile on. Let's, and it's just this natural human impulse. I somehow feel that that the desire to punish evildoers is much stronger than the desire to praise or support good people. It again shows a negativity bias, and there's evolutionary models that work like that. Evolutionary models that say, somewhat paradoxically, you can't have a society full of good, kind, cooperative people unless you're strongly motivated to make the free riders and the traders and the bad people suffer. This punitive desire drives morality. We wouldn't be kind without it.
Yeah, one of my favorite books on this is Christopher Baum's book on the origins of morality, where he has that database of hunter-gatherer groups that punish free riders and how they do it. And there's, they have a whole series of sanctions, starting with, gossiping about the person and saying nasty things, and then scolding them, and then talking to them, and then finally capital punishment. I mean, if the guy is just a bully asshole that just, he's a psychopath, they just take him out on a hunt and come back without him. And that, and then it's hard. It's actually, without modern weapons, it's hard to kill somebody who's, particularly if it's a big, strong alpha male type guy. So they all have to participate, which also diffuses the responsibility, and that diffuses future revenge, strike back by this guy's family or whatever. And so the question is, why wouldn't natural selection operate to get rid of all the bullies? 100%, there should be no psychopaths, but we have like 1% to 3% psychopaths. Why didn't we get rid of all of them?
I think it's sort of a natural, there's a natural trade-off where sometimes being a bully, a free rider, a con man pays off. It's in some way your question is parallel to, given that we have extremely stringent punishments for some actions, why do we still have criminals? Well, the answer is because sometimes criminals get away with it. You're not, if you told me you're planning to rob a bank, I wouldn't necessarily say to you, well, that's irrational because bank robbers end up in prison. Well, maybe you'll rob a bank and you won't get caught. In which case, putting aside other considerations, it's a good move. And so evolution works that way. And also, there's sort of a titration where there's some bad acts that we do in our everyday lives that don't get punished, that are sort of in personal ways and in intimate relationships and everything. And natural selection doesn't weed them out because they don't fall under the eyes of the group.
Kevin Dutton makes the point in his book on. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I love the discussion in Baum's book. He actually says this is why these hunter-gatherer societies are in a sense egalitarian, because it's not like they all have this idea, oh, we should all be egalitarian. Rather, they hate show-offs, and as soon as one person starts boasting, that person runs a serious risk of waking up one morning and finding the group is left without him. And so
right,
so
yeah. He also makes the point. Well, this idea that our hunter-gatherer ancestors were egalitarian, like they were, 60s hippies, where they wanted to share. They had a different psychology. No, they have our psychology. It's just that they have lots of rules about, controlling people who get out of hand. One of my favorite quotes from Thomas Sowell is, "There are no solutions. There's just trade-offs." So one answer to the question is that to get rid of every last criminal, every last bully, free rider, and so on, would take so much of our resources that nothing else would get done. It would be too much of a trade-off. So a group can survive with maybe 1% bully, free rider, psychopaths, or whatever, maybe up to 3%. If it was 10 to 20%, that would be too much. We'd have to do something about it. We'd have to allocate resources. But we can tolerate a certain amount of that and still survive just fine, and therefore put our resources in other places.
Yeah. And you're describing it as a thoughtful process, which sometimes we do. But natural selection can somewhat imitate the thoughtful process in that, you find an equilibrium in societies and individuals that thrive to the right extent with a certain titrated level of punishment. And we do titrate our punishments. I mean, I don't know, when I was at Yale, there was a street and people would park too long and there'd be parking tickets. And, if you want to stop people from parking, you would have the death penalty if somebody parks past the parking meter.
Right.
And that would dissuade it, but it seems a bit heavy duty.
Yes. The other point I was going to make on that was, Kevin Dutton's research on psychopathy, that in fact, a lot of the traits of psychopaths are things we want, like Wall Street traders. And, you want, if you need a lawyer, you want a badass motherfucker lawyer that's going to get in there and fight for you. I don't want some mamby-pamby egalitarian lawyer. I want the guy that's going to get me off. Chris Rock had a funny riff about this years ago when Johnny Cochran was still alive, and he said, you get accused of a crime, you should hire Johnny Cochran. And the guy goes, but that'll make me look guilty. He goes, yeah, but you get to go home. Right? You want the guy that's going to, and then Kevin Dutton has a whole chapter on special forces, and that, these guys are fearless. They're psychopathic in the sense that they're high risk takers. They don't fear things. They don't care about other people, whatever. That's who you want if you want a Navy SEAL guy. And he's got this great example. This is in England with their own special forces, where they put these guys through all these training programs. The programs are mainly to weed out anybody who is not, like 6 standard deviations out on these particular traits, because that's what you want. And the last test is they got the guy down, face down, blindfolded. He's tied up on the ground, and they fire up this truck right near him, and then they take this huge tire and they roll it right up to his head and press it right up against his head to see if he flinches. And if he doesn't flinch, that's our guy. So obviously we don't want the psychopathic bullies that are murderers and total cheats, but you do want some of those traits. So maybe that's another answer to how it survives, because it's not super black and white. There's a kind of a spectrum of traits, some of which are good.
Yeah, I think that that's right. I also think that, we don't want to divide the world into good people and psychopaths. Plainly, there's this continuum, and it's not obvious where to sit on the continuum. You could imagine somebody, plainly, who's an awful person, who you can't trust them, they exploit others, and so on. But on the other hand, if there was somebody who had no self-interest, no no desire to protect their autonomy, who would agree to every request, who would secede to every demand, that person wouldn't thrive either. So there's a certain balance. I mean, one way I've always thought about it is, imagine there's a number 100, and you have to divide that number up into how much it's how much things matter. And one number goes to you, and one number goes to your family, and one number goes to everybody else. Maybe a psychopath is 100, 0, 0, an imaginary psychopath. But you also don't want to be 0, 0, 100 or something. You don't want to be somebody who gives himself no value. To live life projects involves sometimes telling people, no, I don't want to do what you want to do. Actually, I don't want to help you because I want to help myself. If you and I are arguing about a resource, it's not clear that the right thing for me to do, to be a good person, is always say, oh, you get it. So there's that sort of decision process.
Almost a game theory model of trade-offs
Yes.
there, and who's going to cooperate with who. I was also thinking
It's
about
more it's
my
more
other
on
favorite
trade-offs, like
film.
you were saying.
Yeah. Reading your book, I was thinking about The Godfather, one of my favorite films. I've seen this so many times. It touches on so many different emotions and moral conflicts and so on. But until you see part two, if you read the book, this is all in there. But until you see part two, or you see them threaded together nicely, Don Corleone is initially he's just kind of a thug. He's a killer. He's a murderer. He's a mafia don. But with the background, you see, oh, he's actually a hero. He's actually coming up and he cleans up the neighborhood. He kills the thug who was not very moral in his thuggishness. He's kind of a moral mobster in a way, and he's got standards, and he wants people to live up to the standards, and he expects people to be consistent, morally consistent, and he kind of ends up being a hero, even though if you put it in perspective, it's like, yeah, well, but he was a mobster. So there's a character amongst criminals.
There are people who are, monsters to some people and kind saviors to others. And and that's just another form of trade-off. What do I think of the drug lord who does terrible things to his enemies, but actually keeps my neighborhood safe and protected? What do I, or people we look at Nazi commandants and leaders, and we think that they're monsters, pure and pure. But typically, look at them; they love their families, they love their friends. They're just have other moral deficits.
Yeah, to say the least.
To
Right.
say the
No,
least.
the idea that, well, that's the idea behind the banality of evil, that, Hannah Arendt expected Eichmann to be this monster, and he's just sitting there in his suit and tie and looking like a normal businessman, paper pushing bureaucrat.
A boring bureaucrat. Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, so since we brought that up, is it possible that anybody could be Nazis? That any of us have that potential? That most of the Nazi party members who ended up going down this pathway were not moral monsters. They were just regular people. So, to what extent does the environment, think Stanley Milgram or Zimbardo or whatever, social psychologists who look for environmental cues that push people down that direction, this could happen to any of us, or was there some other aberration going on there? What are your thoughts on that?
It's a great question. As you know, there's been a long-standing debate about that among historians, where some people adopt Milgram's view that the Nazis, most of them were just like good people, and that were swayed by obedience, by compliance. And then there was a book came out, Hitler's Willing Executioners, or another book called, I think, Ordinary Men, that
Yeah,
argue, no, these
Christopher
people,
Browning. Yeah.
yes, and these people loved it. They just loved it. They volunteered. They went forward to do it. Um, to answer your question, I think there are individual differences. I think there are people who will be monstrous regardless of their situations. People who would almost always be kind and generous. But to answer your question, I think I used to show the Milgram film when I taught intro psych, and I asked the students, "How many of you would kill a guy?" And they said, "Oh, I wouldn't do that." And you asked them, in World War II, if you were like a German, would you be a Nazi? Would you help run a concentration camp? No, not me. And I think this is an illusion. I think that I'm very much of a nativist, evolved moral systems, but I can't deny the situation has tremendous power. And most people who are doing terrible things aren't monsters, aren't psychopaths. They are doing terrible things from an institutional standpoint, like running a concentration. They're just people like you and me who think, well, this is what everyone's doing, and I'm not a bad guy. Very few people think that they're bad people. It's only later on when the dust settles that we look back and say, my God, these people, murdered millions of people. But but people don't tend to think of themselves that way. So yeah, I think that um, we aren't as good as we think we are.
I've been rethinking this issue. I read Daniel Goldhagen's book, Hitler's Willing
Mhm.
Executioners. There were some criticisms of it I thought were legitimate. That that first of all, it wasn't just that pretty much everybody was anti-Semitic, although anti-Semitism in Europe was much higher than it is now. But there were all the people that helped. So that he wasn't running an A/B experiment. Like, what about the counter examples to your thesis, right? Because historians tend to just have a thesis and they gather evidence to support it, and it looks pretty strong. But what about the counter examples? And he left out a lot of those. Hugo Mercier's book, Not Born Yesterday, makes some really good points that had me rethinking this, that maybe the German people were supportive of the Nazi regime and Hitler in the 30s when he pulled the economy out of the depression and he built the autobahns and more jobs, everybody high employment, the trains run on time, all that good stuff. But they weren't anti-Semitic in the eliminationist, exterminationist sense that most Germans probably were not. Maybe they were happy to see the Jews go or whatever. But by the time that the Nazis implemented the final solution, it was too late. No one could do anything about it. Because early on it was clear any dissenters would just be sent off to concentration camps. So and the Nazis controlled the press. There was no free press. So the two things, pluralistic ignorance or the spiral of silence, where everybody thinks everybody else is going along with it. And if there's no dissent because they all get locked up, and you can see when your neighbor gets
Yeah.
hauled off, well, I'm keeping my mouth shut. And therefore and punishment for dissenters and so on. So therefore, the whole thing could be held afloat. There's good evidence, I think, from historians that no Hitler, no Holocaust, but no Hitler, no World War II. That most of the German military leaders didn't think that in 1939 invading Poland was a good idea. That we're not ready, and if the Allies fight back, we could be in big trouble. And Hitler just didn't care. And he sent these troops in, when they'd be massacred, like in the Soviet Union, and
Yeah.
the losses that were mounted in some of these battles are just staggering. You look at the number of Americans who were killed and wounded, and British who were killed and wounded. Nothing. It's just like 1% of the number of Russians who died, and so no wonder Stalin had such a commanding moral stance of what the post World War II landscape should look like, because they suffered so much. But that's all because of Hitler's idiocy. He just didn't, he was just way off the rails on how to conduct a war and so on. So anyway, the point is that even if you're mostly good Germans, either you think everybody else is going along with it, so you do, or there's no way that my standing up can stop anything, and I'll likely be shipped off to a concentration camp. So keep my mouth shut.
That's fascinating. I think that's really interesting. Um, I think what you see here is a sort of taxonomy of evil, where evil could have different sources. Um, there's sort of pure evil, which is make people suffer for the sake of having them suffer. I think that that's not non-existence. It happens, but it's very rare, much rarer than we think it is. Roy Malameister's book on evil says this is this primary myth that there's monsters among us. Typically, evil tends to be other things. So often, evil is something where people don't intend to do any evil. They're just going around with the crowd and they're afraid to object. There's instrumental evil, where you might, I don't know, you're robbing a bank and you shoot somebody because you're robbing a bank. And that goes on for robbing, you want the money, and you have to shoot somebody to get your way through. And finally, and this is what most interests me the most, is a sort of moralistic evil, where it's not like you're doing something because you lost control. It's not like you're doing something because you want something and somebody got in your way. Rather, you think it's the right thing to do. You are tormenting the Jews, or you are bombing this village, or you are torturing a prisoner. And you think, I'm on the side of the angels here. This is hard work, but there's a purpose to it. I'm working for a good cause. I'm punishing people. The people who were responsible for 9/11 attacks were not psychopaths. They were not saying, I'm an evil villain, bah ha ha ha. They thought they're doing good, important stuff. Um, the Americans who went on to kill untold numbers of people in subsequent wars weren't thinking, "Ha, I'm evil too now." They thought this is important. This is we're in the right. And in some way, it could be said that more, you know, like alcohol, more morality is maybe the cure of, but also the cause of much misery in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. Although, so we don't want to, I don't want to make a moral equivalency argument. Daniel Goldhagen's subsequent book on genocide, opening chapter, he actually accuses Harry Truman of being a war criminal for Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And yet, I think that's not a good argument. It's not the same as, Auschwitz or the bombing of Dresden and Hamburg were the same as Auschwitz, as some people have made that moral equivalency argument. I mean, the point of dropping the nuclear weapons was to end the war, to stop the killing.
Yeah.
The Auschwitz, the point of that was to exterminate every last Jew in Europe or worldwide, just get them all. There's a distinct difference in motivation for conducting acts of evil or whatever you want to call them.
I think that that's right. I think the equation of what the Germans did and what the Americans did is an unfair one. On the other hand, just to push back a little bit, Noam Chomsky has made the case that we often say, well, oh yeah, we killed so and so many people, but we had good intentions and they had bad intentions. And Chomsky's argument is we shouldn't take intentions into account. I would take it in a bit of a different direction and say, typically people doing terrible things have good intentions by their own lights. It's only by our lights they have bad intentions. You know, is George Bush a war criminal on a par with Hitler and Stalin? Intuitively, no, but it's not clear that there's anything really fundamentally different in what he did than in what terrible people do. They all have good intentions. They all think they're doing good things.
Yeah, Goering made this argument at Nuremberg. It's like if we'd won,
Yes,
we'd have you on trial.
it's
Yeah, I know Chomsky's.
it's
I know.
it's it's a moral relativism that neither one of us would accept. But it's not that wrong that the victors write the histories. Um,
Yeah,
if
yeah,
if George Bush was put on trial by and as a war criminal and sentenced to death, and there's an alternative history, we would be learning in our schools about how he was a monster akin to Hitler and Stalin, instead of viewing him as a beloved elder statesman.
yeah. Same thing. We're recording this the week that Colin Powell died, and there was a lot of pushback
Yes,
from the left. This guy's not a hero. He's a war criminal. Look what he did. He lied. He went to the UN. He purposefully lied. To me, it's not clear that he lied. Maybe he sold his soul because George W. Bush told him, get in there and make the case because this is what I want to do, even though we all know it's not true. I'm not sure that's the case. I think maybe they believed Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. I don't know. Clearly, it was a big mistake in hindsight for sure. That should erase an entire career that was pretty stellar and heroic. I don't know. That seems a bit too far. Yeah.
Could have been precedent,
Chomsky's,
people were saying.
yeah, yeah. Chomsky, I know his arguments about U.S. foreign policy, and there's enough bad stuff in our history that he has a good point. I can't completely ignore it. And yet, I just can't help but think, but they're not quite the same. Us propping up a fascist dictator in a South American country because we think he'll be better than the communist dictator. But what's the standard? I guess it would be American interests for free trade with that country. The fascists are more open to trade than communists are. They won't nationalize the companies that we're invested in and so on. So we're going to help rig this election for our guy. The he's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch, the kind of argument. I guess Chomsky would probably push back and say, you're just moral grandstanding. That's just hand waving from an American perspective, that what's wrong with the communist dictator? Maybe that's what they want. National independence. People should be able to choose what they want. Isn't that what we believe in? And if they want the communist dictator, then too bad.
I share your intuition that I always find Chomsky intuitively. I recoil at how harsh he is towards leaders in the United States, Canada as well, certainly Israel. Say, no, no, though they're our guys, they're well intentioned, they're not like the others. But I have to admit, is that because I have a reasoned distinction, or is it because they are our guys? It's because it's my country. I can't, countenance them being seen in the same way as other countries, where I'm much more willing to say, oh yeah, they're criminals, they're monsters, they're tyrants, and it's what Chomsky argues he does, and it goes back to the morality issue we're talking about, is take a sort of point of view of the universe, step back. There was a series, I think, maybe in the magazine Slate, I'm not sure, where they would describe what's happening in the United States, like, and this was around a Trump election, I think, as if it was written about another country far away. And reading about what's happening in the Republican Party and everything, a strong man is trying to do, using the language we use in other countries. It's shocking, but it's not wrong. I think it was I think it was Bertrand Russell who said, what you should do when you read the newspaper is have somebody take away all the names of the countries and put it in different words, put in letters like A, B, C. And now read it. A did this to B and B did this to C. And you'll read it in a very different way.
The viewpoint from nowhere or outside
Exactly.
of the system. Yeah, Bush, I've told the story before that, he talked about his foreign policy was influenced by Nathan Sharansky's book, The Case for Democracy. And so I read that book. And in that book, Sharansky makes the case that, people that say, well, some people are just not ready for democracy is kind of a bigoted, racist attitude. Like, this isn't rocket science. I mean, people want to be free. They want to have their own autonomy and choices. And what's wrong with that? And it's not like brown people just can't figure this out. And, that would be a racist attitude. So we should spread democracy. Democracy is a good thing. But clearly now that we've seen what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, forcing people into democracy, particularly when their countries are, just splintered by all these tribal leaders and conflicts and so on. Some maybe not say the people are not ready for democracy, but clearly some systems or political systems or the societies are not ready for democracy in terms of what is needed to be done. And in any case, America, as the world's policeman running around doing all these things, clearly has,
Yeah.
Kind of ramifications, unforeseen circumstances, and what a catastrophe. $2 trillion. Now, Biden wants to spend $2 trillion on the infrastructure. Maybe we should have stayed home and be isolationist and taken care of our own people.
Yeah. And there is the paradox saying, we want people to have free choice in how they live. And to do so, we're going to invade countries and force people to do this and that. Yeah, like a lot of people, I think, again we go back to trade-offs. I think extreme isolationism would be a terrible thing. And World War II would be the example of a case where intervention was the right thing to do for all sorts of reasons. But I do think that we should look at American adventures overseas the same way we would look at, say, if Russia was doing these adventures overseas, with the same sort of skeptical outlook, and not be so quick to say, oh, we're just trying to spread, sweetness and light.
The double standard test, right? And there it is right there in
Yeah, exactly.
Afghanistan. We
Exactly.
supported we supported the people that were against the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. And then we turn around and they, now they're our enemies. Crazy. I wanted to ask you about, we were talking about Roy Baumeister's book on evil, which I also thought was fabulous. And then, so he makes this argument that, you interview all these serial killers and psychopaths in prison and to a man, and they're pretty much all men. They had moralistic reasons. The reason I did this is because, he slept with my wife, or he cheated me in cards, or he scratched my car, or, whatever. And then I was reading Adrian Rain's book on, the anatomy of violence, in which he, scanned the brains of these serial killers and psychopaths in prison. He had this portable brain scanner, and to a man, again, most of their prefrontal cortex was pretty quiet. They just had no self-control over the urges bubbling up from the brainstem or the amygdala, or wherever these urges come from, down below. And yet, the idea that we all have these urges bubbling up, but fortunately, most of us have this prefrontal cortex that keeps the brake on, kind of a governor on our evil propensities. But when you think about it, what these guys did, never occurs to me. I don't have urges bubbling up like, ooh, I want to rape and kill and pillage and destroy and so on. And thank God I have self-control, so I don't do this. It never occurs to me to do this. And I think, again, it's probably more of an aberration. These are the 1 to 3%ers, or maybe the 1% of the 1%. Some psychopathy is good, but these people are bad, and therefore it's really quite the anomaly. How do you think about that?
Yeah, so we talked about a taxonomy of evil, and one thing I didn't include is loss of self-control. So some bad acts are caused just because people, because someone is very critical of me, and instead of just, responding, I punch him in the nose or I kill him. And a lot of actions are caused, Baumeister points out, in support of the loss of self-control theory, that an enormous amount of violent acts are committed when someone is drunk. And it's not that being under the influence of alcohol or sometimes drugs makes you more moralistic. Rather, you just, the frontal lobe inhibition thing goes out the window. And all of a sudden, some things which are very bad ideas seem like very good ideas. I mean, you say you don't have those impulses, and I believe you. I don't tend to have them either. But maybe this is reflecting in some way our privileged life. It's reflecting two things. First thing, our age. We have aged out of the violent crime business. At a certain point, men just don't commit violence. I'm sure there's a hormonal explanation or some sort of explanation. Our upper body strength has faded too much, but we are just in the age where extreme violence is just very rare. That's one thing. And then there's our situation. Honestly, I'm in a world where people treat me pretty nicely, where I'm not afraid. I'm not in desperate straits. I'm not, So in some way, I'm suggesting that maybe if you were in a different situation and, a bit younger, and, no offense, the cutoff is like, I think, age like 25, really, really quite young. Then the situation would be different. And then impulse control is always an issue.
Yeah, when I in my own mind took David Buss's test on, have you ever fantasized about killing somebody you didn't like? And as you know, he famously found that, like 70% of men it was like 90% of men and 60% of women had some kind of fantasy like that. Not that we act on it, but that I thought, yeah, of course I've thought that. Everybody does. At some point you fantasize about. I guess you could say it's in there, and that, given the circumstances, if I was in a horrible environment in which, revenge on enemies was the only recourse I had for justice.
That's right.
Well, I can see that, self-help justice. Research on that. Okay. A couple other things let's get back to your book. You said, back to the stories, that, the Rocky story is great, but Rocky lost. Actually, so here I'll push back. He won. And here's what he told Adrian the night before the big fight. No one's ever gone the distance with Creed. And if I can go that distance, see, if that bell rings and I'm still standing, I'm going to know for the first time in my life, see, that I wasn't just another bum from the neighborhood. So he won because he made it, so it depends what you mean by winning.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Winning is relative to a goal, and he didn't win the fight, but it's fair enough. He did achieve other goals. Um, there are other examples of sports movies which end with losses. I think Friday Night Lights, the movie, ends with a loss.
Yes, right.
Um, no spoilers here, but I enjoyed season one of Ted Lasso, and from a sports perspective, it didn't go so well. But the general point is we love people battling obstacles, and how that works out for them is a secondary thing. I think I think a movie that ends with the victory and everyone cheering and everything, that's often a good pick me up. But it doesn't have to. You could do a very successful thing, which could end on failure. The failure would have to be interesting, maybe. But I accept your correction about Rocky. Is this true? And then he did win.
Another
And
movie.
he did win in Rocky. He did win in Rocky too,
That's
if I
right.
remember this.
That's let's see, did he yes, I think that's right, he did. And then Rocky 3 anyway, Rocky 25, he's still going. Another one of the films, I think you mentioned Fargo. I don't know what's so compelling about this movie. I've seen it, I don't know, a dozen times. It's funny, it's tragic, it's I don't know what. It's just violence run amok. It's there's just so many morality plays at work there. I'm not sure what makes that
I
such
love
a great film.
I love the Coen brothers, and I raise this in a point where so many of our entertainments revolve around an exploration of moral issues. We don't about being fascinated by negative things, but we're just fascinated by morality. And and so you have these children cartoons, or which are sort of what we call moral pornography, which is very, very simple. Everything's sort of stripped down. Good versus evil, the brotherhood of evil mutants fighting the good mutants, and that. But then you get to sort of more thoughtful explorations. And one thing I've always thought about the Coen brothers movies is um, they're really explorations of morality. And one theme that they have, and it's in Fargo, and it's also in their very first movie, I think Blood Simple, which is violence cannot be contained. That once you begin on the path of violence, in fact, getting people to hurt one another, it spills out of control. And that's what Fargo is about. But Fargo also has, I mean, we've talked about the movie forever, but has an extremely wonderful main character. I think Frances McDormand character, the pregnant cop, uh, and wonderful side character. It's just a gem of a movie, and it pushes so many buttons for us. It's such a delight. But even like more recent, like True Grit, this was also another morality play.
Yeah, there's that scene where so here's where the violence, except they were just going to kidnap the wife so that the guy could get the ransom money from his father-in-law. And in a trade-off, he sets them up with a new car, the tan Sierra, and they didn't have the plates on there, and they didn't have the right sticker or something, so they get pulled over by the police. And then the one thug says, "I'm going to take care of this right here," and he tries to bribe him with the little common knowledge thing where the he shows his driver's license with the $100 bill sticking up just a little bit, and the cop says, "What is this?" He goes, "Well, I just thought we could take care of that here in Brainerd." He
You
says,
pay the
"Step out of
fine
the
right there.
car."
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. That actually happened to me in East Germany in 1989, just before the fall. I took a trip to Berlin and then I drove to Jena, and I got pulled over by the police. This is the East German police. And I didn't speak German and he didn't speak English. So he basically pulls out the book to show me what I did. I was in the left lane for too long. The left lane is only supposed to be for passing, I guess. And I stayed in it too long. So he points this out. And then he points to me what the fine is. And I said, "Okay, well, what do I do?" And he just sticks his hand out like, "You pay me now in cash." And I'm like, "Oh, I see. Okay." That's
So
taking
we got
care of it
around
right here in Brainerd.
all the game theory and
But in the
plausible
Fargo movie, of course,
deniability and everything.
yeah, that's right. So, but in the Fargo movie, the other thug pulls the gun out of the glove box and shoots the cop, and then somebody drives by, so they got to go kill them because they saw what happened, and then so
Yeah.
that's your violence run amok.
Yes. 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 We could have a whole discussion of the Coen Brothers movies and the themes that they they explore. But that's definitely one of them.
Okay, and a couple other issues here on your final chapters on meaning and purpose here. So you quote from The Matrix, where Agent Smith tells Morpheus how the world they are experiencing, a simulation created by malevolent computers, came to be. Quote, did you know that the first Matrix was designed to be a perfect human world where none suffered, where everyone would be happy? It was a disaster. No one would accept the program. Entire crops were lost. Some believe that we lack the programming language to describe your perfect world, but I believe that as a species, human beings define the reality through misery and suffering. So the perfect world was a dream that your primitive cerebrum kept trying to wake up from. So this idea of a utopia or heaven, bliss, this is not the human condition.
Isn't that a beautiful origin story? I just,
It is, yeah.
um, and in some way, it could be taken as a variant of the Genesis story, where we had paradise, but we mucked it up, and we but in this story, I think it's more to the point. It was not suited for us. I begin in an earlier chapter. This is kind of a shout back to. I was with my partner, and we were watching. We were waiting to watch Avengers Endgame, and they had a commercial in the theater. We were ad for a bank, and I'm reading the story, and I was fascinated by it. And then so I went back home and Googled, and it turned out to be from Alan Watts, who's the guy who brought Zen to the West. And the story goes like this: it's the Matrix story, which is imagine you fell asleep one night, and then all of a sudden you're in a lucid dream where you can do whatever you want for I forget 95 years. And at first you'd be like hedonistic blowout. You get every pleasure you could imagine. You wake up the next night, you fall asleep. You get the same situation. You said, well, soon what you do is you'd say you throw obstacles in front of yourself. You'd set up goals which maybe you wouldn't succeed. You'd have things that didn't come easy to you. And he goes on and on in that vein and says, maybe that's the life we're living now. And the idea is that I think we are naturally suited for trouble. And a life that would be too easy, we just wouldn't thrive in it.
Yeah, to me, this is the problem of the idea of heaven. What is it? What is it? Why would I want to go there? Christopher Hitchens famously described it as celestial North Korea, where you have this all-knowing dictator that knows everything you're thinking and doing, and this would be terrible. I remember when I was a Christian and in college, I was a born-again evangelical, and I was, witnessing as you do as an evangelical, one of my professors, and tell him how great heaven was going to be, and he doesn't want to miss out on that. And he said, are there golf courses there? Are there tennis courts? Are there anything I can do that's challenging? Because it sounds boring. And I think that's right.
Yeah, I think the problem with heaven isn't that it doesn't exist, but it's that maybe it couldn't exist. There's no coherent rendition of an eternity of bliss. It just doesn't fit with our natures. And so you have to have a more mystical thing where you become one with God or whatever. And maybe that's coherent. But a sort of folk notion of heaven, which is just a lot of fun, in the end would be really boring. And your professor would get bored playing golf, ultimately, no matter how difficult it got.
That's true, right? Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you got to mix it up. Well, then this has political implications, because forget the religious heaven, the idea of utopia on earth, just setting up the perfect society is not possible. I love this quote you quoted from George Orwell. I quoted him in my Heavens on Earth book as well. His review of Mein Kampf. Hitler knows that human beings don't only want comfort, safety, short working hours, hygiene. They also, at least intermittently, want struggle and self-sacrifice. Whereas socialism, and even capitalism in a more grudging way, have said to the people, I offer you a good time. Hitler has said to them, I offer you struggle, danger, and death. And as a result, a whole nation flings itself at his feet. That's such a deep insight in human nature.
Yeah, Orwell was very sharp. I mean, I think it's really worth knowing what people want. Um, there was a Robert A. Heinlein novel I remember from reading it as a kid, and they were trying to get recruits to fight the aliens or something. And originally they just said, don't worry, this is safe. And then they decided to say, this is dangerous. And then more people came in. There's some sort of appetite for that. I don't think that this means we are destined to live in a world of perpetual war and conflict. I think the truth is what we do now in privileged countries is we do it in our imagination. So, it seems to me that just about every movie these days is some sort of Marvel DC comic book movie. We've gone totally and we don't have to fight evil ourselves. We watch other people do it. Um, Psychologists tend to forget about how video games are part of people's lives. The culture world just ignores this, but it's an enormous part of people's lives. And so many of these games are war simulations. So, and I think this is for the better, but you have a 17-year-old and he wants to go off to war and you say, I got you an Xbox. Do it that way. Okay. And then the world's, I think that's a better way to do things.
Yeah, the idea that young men need to go to war to develop character. Well, there are safer ways to do it, like sports.
Yeah,
Something, some
exactly.
challenge. I think you mentioned your son is a mountain climber. Is he
Yeah.
an alpinist? Yeah. Well,
He does
yeah. See, to
mostly
me,
bouldering. Yeah.
bouldering. Yes, yes. So to me, the idea of sports as a replacement for that. When I was a teenager and then, say 18, 19, thinking about these things, and the Vietnam War was coming to an end. The draft ended just as I graduated from high school, fortunately. The idea of going off to war as heroic was not at all in the culture. It was the opposite of that, because that war was such a mess and culture was different at the time. But I got into sports, and I think sports can do it in a more controlled way. So here we're back to your controlled suffering. So when I got into long distance bike racing, when I did race across America, and but the worst that could ever happen would be I would just stop, just pull over and get in the motorhome and drive off to a hotel. Short of my getting run over by a truck or something, there's a little bit of risk being on the roads, but not much. And my ex brother-in-law was an alpinist. He did Everest. He finally finished Everest. He tried several times, but most of that. You talk about this, it's not like a high adrenaline sport. I mean, you're
No.
just grinding along. He used to tell these stories where they would just sit in the tent for days on end, waiting for some storm to pass over. They'd read novels and so on. And when they're walking, when they're trudging along, they're just kind of one foot in front of the other, and this goes on for hours and hours and hours. And there's nothing like high risk, super adrenaline kind of aspect to it. But I think it's when you're done and you look back, it's like I did that. I feel good about
Yeah.
myself. I was able to accomplish this. Now I can go out into life and do other things, knowing, well, if I did that, then I could do this, all in a relatively controlled way.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm glad you mentioned sports because it was incomplete on my list. I talked about movies and video games, but team sports are, the closest many of us will get to going to war, where, you have a hierarchy, you have training, and then ultimately you go into battle. And this isn't an accident. It's not like, oh my God, what a crazy coincidence. I think team sports evolved to scratch the same itch that would otherwise bring us into war. I think your endurance athletes like you fall in a bit of an interestingly different category. And I don't know. I find it. We've talked before about your adventures as an endurance athlete, and I don't know. You've read what I had to say about it. Is there anything you would add based on your own experience about the value of those experiences, or the lack of value? I don't
Yeah,
know.
yeah, definitely. It was that if I could do this, then taking on other projects, gives me confidence, and also, how to get from here to there. Like writing a book, for example, is quite the undertaking, as you know. And if you just sat down and think, okay, I'm going to write the whole book, and I'm just going to start right now, it's just too overwhelming. So, like in RAM, the first time I did it, I remember waking up and I took a short sleep break into Mexico, about 1,000 miles into it, and I just felt like that's it, it's over. I just can't go on. My knees are all swollen, and I feel like crap, and saddle sores and so on. So I thought, okay, I'm just going to ride 1 mile. I'm going to just go 1 mile, and then maybe I'll quit. Then I got to a mile. It's like, hey, my knees are starting to feel a little bit. I'm getting warm. I'm going to get to that grain silo. There's grain silos all across America. If I can get to there, and I could see it's like 5 miles up the road. Okay, then I got there, and it's like, okay, I'm going to see if I can make it to the next state border. State borders are big in RAM. Like, oh, I made it to the Ohio border. Okay, now I can make it to the Virginia border, and so on.
Yeah.
And so those kind of little obstacles. And so writing a book, for example, is like, okay, I'm just going to write this one chapter this month. Okay, now I'm just going to write this first section of the first chapter this week. And then, so today I need to write, a paragraph or, my opening. I'm going to find an epigram so I can open the book with, or something like that. And then so it's just kind of the piecemeal aspect of trying to accomplish big things was very informative for me, having done that. Yeah, something like that. I think all kinds of sports, the team sports. I think cycling's mostly a solo sport. Team sports, which I used to play baseball when I was in high school, and a little bit after that. There, it's more the motivation is I don't want to let down the other guys.
Yes.
It's not just individual accomplishment, like I want to because I want to be highlighted or feel good about myself. It was the opposite. It was like I don't want to fuck up, and then everybody's disappointed in me or mad at me.
Yes. And in fact, this is often said about war, which is, men who march into battle say they're terrified of death, but they're more terrified of the shame and betrayal of abandoning their group. And so, in team sports has a sort of analogy to that. And you're right. I mean, I'm enough of a cynical psychologist where I'd sort of say, well, it's an empirical question whether you being an endurance athlete um, helped you write books later on. But it's at least plausible. And this was often said that the skills you acquire, and you're actually raising a good one, which is a sort of planning difficult events and learning to slice them up and learning how to deal with them. Simple discipline, preparation, and so on serve you well for other pursuits, which have a sort of a similar structure. And so I don't think parents are exactly wrong telling their kids to do something of that nature.
Yeah. I mean, so much of life is that. Pinker makes the point in Enlightenment Now that I put it this way in Heavens on Earth, but it came from his original argument, was that the second law of thermodynamics is the first law of life. That's how I phrased it. But Steve makes this point that, everything runs down, that, there's just so many more ways for things to go wrong than to go well. And that all of life is going to be that. It's just built into the nature of the universe. And the analogy of the sandcastle, there's only so many ways grains of sand can be congealed to form some kind of structure that looks, meaningful to us. But there's, a gazillion, infinite number of ways the grains of sand can be glommed into nothingness. And that's what life is like.
Yes, constant fight against randomness and entropy. That's how I describe my day.
I was going to tell this interesting story, but before I do that, I wanted to ask you about the kind of the neuroscience of the possible link in the brain between pleasure and suffering or pain, like in sadomasochism or whatever. Is there something in there where there's a link between neural networks or something where, if you're on the edge of some pleasure and some pain also triggers that and bumps it up, or is there some link in there?
There's some neuroscience work on the balance between pleasure and pain. I got to say, and this is an unpopular thing to say, but whenever you look closely at the neuroscience data for just about anything, it tends to be fairly unimpressive. It tends to be interesting if you're interested in the details of brain anatomy, brain physiology, brain functioning. When it comes to explaining what we're interested in, it doesn't often adds very little. But having said that, so for instance, there's some really nice studies I talk about early in the book about how what counts as pleasure, what counts as pain is calibrated to your expectations and to what had happened before. The way they put it is the brain is a difference engine. If I ask you how you're feeling, the only right answer is compared to what. And so if you're playing a game and you lose $10, if you expected to win $10, then you feel sad. You expected to lose $100, you feel good. If you're told this is really going to hurt, and it hurts just mildly, it can actually feel good. But if it hurts, so there's these calibrations, and it turns out that at a neural level, parts of the brain associated with pleasure and pain light up in response, not according to the actual physical sensations you're getting, but to the physical sensations relative to the expectations. Now, this is a sort of neuroscience Shakespeare version of Shakespeare's thing. There's nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so.
Right. But in your discussion on sadomasochism and so forth, I guess what I'm asking is that if a couple are pleasuring each other, pressing the usual buttons and so on, but then they add to it an element of pain, like I'm also going to pinch your nipples or, squeeze this part of your body really hard till it's painful. If you were doing it in some other context, that would not be pleasurable. But in the context of a
Yes.
sexual encounter where you're also pleasuring, somehow that adds to the pleasure.
I'm not sure neuroscience has much to add to that. They haven't got
Okay.
people in
Yeah.
the scanner while doing those things. It's hard to get everybody to
Right.
fit. Um,
Right.
there have been actually MRI that people actually having sex with each other, and pleasure centers of the brain light up. But
Yeah. Yeah. Of
but
course.
the intuition is right, which is sometimes pain can become an accelerant of pleasure. I mean, one interesting finding, uh, and maybe you can see this in, well, the interesting finding is at a certain level, pleasure and pain often blend into each other. So one example is it was a study done, and where they looked at people, pictures of people experiencing orgasm versus picture of people in great pain, and they're actually hard to
Mm.
tell apart. And then there was a paper in
Whoa.
Science, so it's a respectable paper, that looked at experienced athletes, and these captured athletes at this greatest moment of accomplishment versus their moment of failure. And again, you have this contorted face. I'm not going to try to do it. You have this contorted face, and
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
hard to tell what they're feeling. So one theory, which is sort of neurosciency, is that often pleasure and pain are compensatory, and that if you feel too much of one thing, you get a reaction for another thing to kind of dampen it. So, like one example is when these fangirls see the Beatles, you know, they shriek. Why are you shrieking? They shriek as if sometimes if you're really happy, you cry, and it's as if at a certain system, the
Interesting.
elation is so much that there's a compensatory thing to sort of in the opposite direction to shut it down. That's one
Right.
argument that's been made.
That would be difficult research to get funding for, much less ethically
Yes.
conducted.
Yes.
Uh, yeah, that reminds me of going. I went to a Pentecostal church. I've been to several of them, in which the people are speaking in tongues and they're singing and dancing and they're quite emotionally aroused. And I remember seeing some of these people like writhing on the floor, looking like they were orgasmic, but
Yeah.
they weren't having sex at all. It was just some other kind of emotions, but it was indistinguishable to me from that.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a kind of a puzzle, which I don't answer, why the facial expression used to communicate different things are indistinguishable in these cases, are virtually indistinguishable. And one answer is that it has nothing to do with signaling. It's just that at certain level, the brain treats them equivalently. These extremes.
Right. Right. Anyway, so I don't know, it must have been about 2,000 miles into the first race across America. At that time, it was called Great American Bike Race. You can actually watch it on YouTube. Um, so on my crew, I had a chiropractor and a massage therapist, and so every break I would take, the massage therapist would not just massage my legs and stuff, but my feet were getting really sore. So imagine at the time that way pedals were structured, there was a pedal axle that came out,
Mhm.
and there was like a structure on it, and the shoe was on top of it with a cleat that locked into this little slot. And so the ball of your picture this is the ball of your foot. And so here I had like, I don't know, like 10 million pedal strokes of pressure on this, and it really hurt. So she would take her knuckles and do this, kind of just digging her knuckles into the ball of my feet. And it felt so good. I mean, it was almost orgasmic, but it was painful. I mean, I remember
Yes.
lying there just thinking, this is the weirdest thing of all. I mean, I thought she said, should I keep going? I go, yeah, don't stop. It was like having sex. Of course, obviously, there's other people in the motorhome, and so. But it was like, this is so weird. It feels so good, but it feels so bad. And so that made me wonder: is there something in the brain where they're so closely linked that that they're stimulating both?
That's a great example. Paul Rosen has a study where he lists what he calls benign masochism, low level forms of pain that we get pleasure from. And one of his things on his list is massage pain. And in some way,
Mm,
that's a very everyday example, which is you go for a massage and it hurts, but you like it. And and that's just interesting. You know it hurts because if you felt that way under any other circumstances, like if all of a sudden you weren't with a massage therapist, but you stepped off the bike and then you pressed your foot and it really felt the same way, you would just say that sucks out.
Yes.
But
Yes.
somehow that circumstance, know under the control, knowing it's voluntary, knowing that the situation becomes really pleasurable. And that's a great example.
I just had one of those massage. I had a total hip replacement, so I had to go to some physical therapy, and then the physical therapy was not that great. So I got a recommendation of a kind of a deep tissue therapeutic massage. Well, this is no happy ending. There was no happy ending, happy beginning, happy middle. It was miserable. And she's digging in where they're not just her knuckles and her elbow, but she had like these wooden sticks that she would like get in there with the muscles, and yet afterwards it was like my body was just kind of filled with endorphins. I'm just like kind of glowing, like this is weird,
Yeah.
right? It's like I wouldn't want to repeat it, but I think it works for some reason.
Yeah. Yeah. And, it's the fact we get pleasure of such a thing is just incredibly interesting.
All right, just a couple last things here because we're up on, oh my gosh, we're right at 2 hours. How about that? I love this quote you have from Chief Justice John Roberts, commencement speech in 2017. Now, the commencement speakers will typically also wish you good luck and extend good wishes to you. I will not do that, and I'll tell you why. From time to time in years to come, I hope you will be treated unfairly so that you will come to know the value of justice. I hope you will suffer betrayal because that will teach you the importance of loyalty. Sorry to say, but I hope you will be lonely from time to time so that you don't take friends for granted. I wish you bad luck, again, from time to time so that you'll be conscious of the role of chance in life and understand that your success is not completely deserved and that the failure of others is not completely deserved either. Wow, that's a powerful statement that really captures a lot of what you're trying to do in this book.
It's a powerful statement, but he's talking here about unchosen suffering. I mean, he chooses it for other
Okay.
people. And I'm somewhat skeptical in two ways. First thing is, I mean, it's nice, a nice expression of things, but he doesn't have to wish that upon people. Everybody will get failure and loneliness, disappointment, bad luck. You cannot immunize yourself against this. So they're going to get it no matter what. And second, it's by no means clear that that these bad experiences do make us kinder, more empathic, more altruistic. There's a lot of debate about that. I think there's some evidence that there's a continuum for everything. So some people do make it through life fairly unscathed. And on the extremes, there's some studies I talk about in the book finding that people who have had very, very, very few bad experiences maybe have less tolerance for pain and maybe are less altruistic. But I think for the most part, um, sometimes suffering makes us worse. Sometimes being the target of unfairness and injustice doesn't make us more attuned to justice and fairness for others, but makes us self-protective and less willing to help others. So it's not clear how good his advice is.
Hmm.
That, you
Interesting.
know, there's a large literature. It seems that there's a large literature on trauma, and we're more resilient than we think we are. But the claim that this sort of negative experiences make us better people has never had much support.
Interesting. Yes, because you bring up Jordan Peterson and Slavoj Zizek on suffering. You quote Jordan, the purpose of life is finding the largest burden you can bear and bearing it. And Zizek, the only life of deep satisfaction is a life of eternal struggle. Well, you first, dude. I don't want that.
So I quote them positively. I say, yeah, this is the theme of my book, the importance of struggle thing. But then I also say something like, yeah, it's a bit overblown. Like, yes, you should find the biggest thing you have and move it. But also, when it's a hot day, take a cool drink, hang out with your kids. It's back to pluralism. And what worries me about what I like about these quotes is they capture the importance of suffering. I quote them favorably. What I don't like about them is it makes me like that's the only thing. We want other things too, including pleasure. So again, pluralism.
Yeah. I do wonder if that's, I mean, part of the appeal Jordan Peterson. It's a curious thing. A lot of people have talked about, why did he, kind of leap out of the box of academic eggheads into superstardom of a public intellectual? In part because, first of all, he gives advice, a lot of advice, because he's a clinician, okay? And a lot of people seem to need advice, like, set goals. Oh, I never heard that before. Things like that. Or be tough because life is suffering. Yeah, okay. And so, what do you think is the appeal there to not just him, but to others that talk about those issues?
It's funny. I'm now I moved from Yale. I'm emeritus professor at Yale. I'm now at University of Toronto, and I'm going to get in Jordan Peterson's office when
Oh my
when he
God,
cleans out his
really?
stuff in about a week.
Oh
So
my
this is
God,
a strange coincidence.
well, that's wild.
I've been fascinated by his appeal. I strongly disagree with some things he says. I strongly agree with others. I think he's interesting. I think part of it is he has this very persuasive, powerful presentation style, this mix of confidence, which a lot of people have, but also very deep emotionality, which is a lot of people don't have. A lot of people are just more cold presenters. He's a very hot presenter. I think part of it is what you're saying, which is he gives advice and he tells people they're messing up and they should do better. And there's kind of an appetite for that. Um, and I think in many ways, and I don't think he would disagree with that, he has served as a father figure in this style of presentation, his work to many, particularly many young men. Um, the rest of us who don't need a father figure can look at his work more critically and assess the good parts and the bad parts. And I think there are good parts to it. But a large part of his appeal is his role in that way. He's sort of I wouldn't say guru, but a very strong figure in people's lives.
I wonder if that's part of human nature. We need that, a father figure, or the appeal of Trump. What's the appeal of Trump? Well, he stands up to the people I can't stand up to. I mean, this is one of the appeals. He owns the libtards. He puts down the politically correct people. I want to do that, but I can't do that. I got to keep my mouth shut at work or else I'll get fired. But he can do it, and he's a strong leader, something like that.
I think there's a lot going on. I think there's a lot going on with Trump. I don't think people think Trump is a father figure, even his biggest fans. I don't, he doesn't come off that way. He's too much a creature of his appetites. I think there's a couple of things. One thing is a lot of people aspire to be Trump. They see him with his wealth and his sexual life and his adventures, his appetites, and they say, "Wow, I want to be that guy." Um, and I think something else is exactly what you're saying, which is that there's a lot of Americans who feel screwed and disrespected by both of the major parties. Trump is a Republican, but he's a Republican who, is a very funny status in that party, and they see Trump as a big middle finger to the very people who have mocked them. The liberals, yes, but also the Republicans, the rich fat cat Republicans who don't really care about them. And there's Trump saying, I'm one of you, strange as it may seem, and if you approve of me, you know, think what a poke in the eye that is to everybody else.
All right, let's talk about last two things here. Living in the now. You talk about the now as being 2 to 3 seconds, the time it takes Paul McCartney to sing "Hey Jude." That's such a great analogy.
It's not my example, but it's a good example.
Yeah, I like that. Well, I've heard Eckhart Tolle give a speech about living in the now. In fact, it was an event with he and Deepak Chopra, who's a friend. So he invited me and Leonard Mlodinow. So we went and did the behind the curtain visitation, and then sat in the audience. This was at the Shrine Auditorium in LA, about 3,000 people, each of whom paid, I don't know, it was like $200-300 a ticket. Astonishing. And, the parking lot was filled with Teslas and Lexuses and Mercedes. I mean, these are not suffering people. And, these were kind of the beautiful people from Hollywood, actually, that were there. And, and they're basically, walking around on stage in jeans and T-shirts and bare feet, talking about just living in the now and possessions are not important and so on. And, kind of the Western Buddhist message, I guess. So what's the appeal of that in human psychology?
So under one way of looking at it, living in the now is terrible advice. You should be planning for the future. You should be ruminating, be thinking about the past. Living in the now is advice you'd give to to a rabbit or a skunk. It's like it's not human consciousness escapes from the now and does all sorts of really cool things. And I know I'm taking it too literally. Um, but I think part of the appeal of this is in some odd way the same appeal of sadomasochism sometimes, which is consciousness weighs on us. You're talking to me, but you're wondering, how do I look and what am I to do next? What am I to do later on in the day? And if you're left alone with your thoughts, God knows where they go. And to have the power to just ignore all of that and focus on the present would be like a superpower. And it's what proponents of mindfulness meditation say they can give you, what religious traditions they could give you. This escape from the self. And I think that there a lot of the appeal comes from. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yes, I think the another example of I've been to the Esalen Institute in Big Sur several times, putting on seminars on science and religion, and so but I went to some other workshops, one of which was these, living in the now, of Eckhart Tolle's message, and I get that, like I'm in Big Sur, I'm right on the cliffs of the Pacific Ocean, I'm sitting in these natural hot tubs, I'm watching the waves crash, I should be in the now for sure. I don't want to miss that. But I kept thinking, yeah, but my mortgage is due next Friday, so I got to get
Yeah.
back and get to work here. I can't live in the
Yeah.
now. So, but I think the message
Whenever,
was,
whenever I'm in
what
a
you just said,
yeah.
that
Whenever I'm in a
the
now, I want
thought
to check my
flooding of all the
email.
things that, yeah, of all the negative things that you think too much about. Just ruminating about, my boss said this or that guy said that, and I'm really upset. And then you spend 2 hours and it's gone. You've lost that 2 hours. I mean, that's in the
Yes,
past. It already happened. The future hasn't happened. So you only have the now, actually.
that's right. That's right. Being able to control that and shut it off at will and just be in the present is a great power, I think. Um, but again, you don't want to entirely lose the ability to ruminate and to plan and to think about things. You know, I read somebody once advise when you go for walks, just focus on the walk. Don't think about anything. And I'm thinking, I listen to podcasts when I go on walks. It's a great way of learning stuff. Or sometimes I think about stuff. You know, why is that wrong? I'd be a horrible Buddhist, I think.
I've tried meditation. I went to Deepak's place down in Carlsbad. It's quite nice. But it was the joke is, they give you the little mantra and you're like, oh my God, I'm so bored. Just the thoughts just keep flooding in. And, but
Yes,
supposedly if you do it for, I don't know, months or a year or two, then you really get into it. I guess the benefit I could see would be if you have a lot of thought flooding of negative emotions and it's destructive to your
yes.
life. It's not good. There I can see the real value to that. There's probably more that I don't understand. But let's finish up talking about your and my favorite subject of religion. I'm like Dawkins and others, a pretty strong critic of religion. But when I try to put on my other hat and think, well, why do people believe it? Why did they join? And in atheist circles, they think, well, if we could just counter the arguments for God's existence, then people would be atheists. Well, I don't think so, because they're not going to church in the first place to get
Yeah,
schooled in the cosmological argument and the fine-tuned argument and so forth. That's not why they go there. They go there for the music and the social aspects and the moral message, the kind of uplifting, good feeling. The food afterwards and free parking. Right? There's kind of a package deal there. And
yes.
in reading your book, I was thinking, this is another role that religion plays that's probably pretty valuable. Life is hard. There's a lot of suffering. And we're going to turn that into a kind of good thing. That this is how our religion presents to you a solution to all that suffering, and where you become a better person, and God is involved and somehow recognizes this, and you get rewarded later, and it's kind of a package deal there.
I think that's right. We're on the same page regarding the factual claims about religion. I think you can sensibly ask whether these religious claims are true or false, and for the most part, they're not. They're false. But that's not why people are doing it. People are doing it for a range of reasons. Some of it is the social connectedness, the part of a community that gives reassurance and value. And part of it, I think, is and this is what I talk about in the book, um, is that it answers certain questions in a very nice way. I know some cognitive scientists say we appeal to we like religion because it tells us where humans come from and what the origin of the universe is. And I'm thinking, I'd like to know the answers to those, but I don't think I stay up nights worrying about it. But religion, all religions, give logic and meaning and purpose to our unchosen suffering. And that's very powerful. That's very powerful. I don't care that much, maybe, about where the earth came from, but I care a lot as to why somebody I love has cancer, as to why I just lost my job at the worst possible time. And religion has answers to that. They could say, it's God's will, it's for a higher purpose, and there'll be a payoff at the end. If you're Christian, you say, a lot of suffering is reliving the suffering of Christ on the cross. Um, it is a way in which God speaks to you. C.S. Lewis says, God whispers to us when we're happy, but shouts when we're in pain. And I say, oh, okay, that feels better now. It's not just random crap. It feels better now. And so I think that is part of the appeal of religion. You don't have religion, then it's just bad stuff happens. And that's not very good.
Right. So it's the solution to the problem of evil and why bad things happen to good people. Here, I think, again, as part of the appeal to Jordan Peterson, he's kind of almost a religious leader, and it's not clear how religious he really is. I've asked him directly, and it's hard to get a straight answer out of him. Do you believe in God? Well, that would take me 40 hours to answer. Oh, okay. Because what do you mean by God? What do you mean by this or that? The resurrection, did Jesus, Jesus probably existed. He was probably crucified. But did he rise from the dead? Well, there's 100 billion people that lived and died before us. Not one of them has come back. So it's 100 billion to 1 odds. And then you can apply a Humean, proportional evidence argument or a Carl Sagan, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Probably didn't happen because the evidence is crappy and so on. But maybe that's missing the whole point. Maybe whether it happened or not is irrelevant. It's the, bearing your own cross, bearing your own burden. The suffering is part of life, and, you can be born again, you can start over, you can find redemption through your suffering. Maybe that's the real message.
I think there's a deep point there. I think both for Jordan himself, what Jordan's preaching, and everyday people with everyday religions, when you say, could you be clear on the details of heaven because it's incoherent, or do you believe in the resurrection? To some extent, these are, I think, perfectly reasonable questions for somebody to ask about people's beliefs. But in another way, it misses the point for these people. Um, it's like I say, I think my sons are the best young men in the world. And you say to me, can you enumerate their positive qualities and their negative qualities and compare them on average? Well, it's not what I mean. When I'm attesting my love for them, my connection to them, the feelings I have towards them. It's not meant as an objective statement. And I think the same thing is true for most religious claims. I'm not like saying there's some people who take religious claims literally and would love to get into debate with you, but the vast majority of religious believers don't have the belief in the same way. And I know you've thought a lot about this. I think we're on the same page on this.
Yeah, I've also thought about this. Another debate in humanist atheist circles is, well, when religion goes into decline, do we need to replace it with something like a secular religion, like a secular humanism is a kind of religion, because people need religion. But maybe religion's too broad a word. Maybe people need something. Maybe there's like 6 elements of religion that each element of which can be replaced by some secular institution, something like that.
I think that's right. I think that it's not hard to imagine replacing the ritual of religion with other rituals. And there are other rituals. Football games have tons of rituals. Everything, there's a lot of other rituals. The community, a bowling league is a community. If there's also an academic department could be a community. But what we're talking about now, the giving meaning to suffering, that I think is irreplaceable. I think if you give up religion, you lose it and you can't get it anywhere else. And I think it's reasonable to say, well, okay, that's, life's not perfect. We have to give up some things. But, if you give up religion, you give up the afterlife. And it's not small potatoes,
No.
but you can't replace that.
Amazing. Yes. Great discussion, Paul. Thanks for your time. This is the longest podcast I've ever had. Almost 2.5 hours.
This has been so much fun. We'll see how many people are here to end, but this has been tons of fun. Very enjoyable discussion.
And I didn't even get to ask you the big questions on free will and determinism and consciousness and all that. We'll save that for another day.
Next time.
Because I know you thought a lot about these things. So what's next on your research and writing plate?
I'm doing a lot of stuff on moral psychology in children. I'm very interested in dehumanization. And I'm thinking of writing a book on perverse choices, why people choose to do things that make no sense, but they're aware that they make no sense. So just,
wow.
Different projects, but mostly thinking about the current book, which will go on for like a couple of months.
Nice. All right. Well, thanks, Paul. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much.